Welcome, everyone. It's a joy to see everyone here. We're still waiting for a couple of people to come in, but I will go ahead and start to stay on time. And even with a little bit of a bumpy start, we're still about only 5 minutes late. So this is wonderful. So welcome to day 2 of our conference here at St. Nersēs Armenian Seminary in New York. Thank you for those of you joining us from Armenia, and I know there's some of you from Europe joining us today, so thank you very much for accommodating the time difference. It's an honor to run this conference on a week like this because I believe there are several commemorative events related to Artsakh between yesterday and today, so I just want to take a moment to remember the small victories that we have achieved, but also very briefly, I wanted to say this yesterday, but I'll just say this today. As someone who's studied and also come from a genocide history, it's always been my passion to know that we actually are most victorious and most, really doing the honor to our ancestors and our survivors by doing what we're doing today. This is how we keep our history alive, and also this is how we actually live into what it is that they died for, the martyrs in our history, but also the very people not too far ago in our history. So just a very brief note on that to start our day today. So thank you everyone for your contribution and for your presence. It is an honor to introduce you today to a friend and a colleague of mine who I actually met a decade ago, 2015. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to collaborate with you, Garnik, on this panel at this conference. Garnik Harutyunyan is a senior researcher at the Matenadaran, at the Department of the Study of Armenian Texts from the 5th to the 14th centuries, a very broad range. He holds a PhD in history from Yerevan State University. He is a scholar of theology and an expert in the history of Armenian canon law. Between 2010 and 2018, he worked as a chorologist at the Department of Codicology of Matenadaran, From 2014 to 2021, he was an assistant professor at the Faculty of Theology at Yerevan State. Between 2018 and 2020, he worked at the Gevorkian Theological Seminary as a head of the postgraduate department. He currently teaches courses on canon law, the Armenian calendar, or the Tomar, Barza Tomar, in the seminary, and is a researcher at Yerevan State University. His recent research deals with the early modern Armenian theological literature, particularly the genre of the Testament of Passion, sermons which include sermons on Good Friday, which he studies in the interconfessional and interreligious contexts of the 15th to 19th centuries. We also have Seda Manukyan with us. This is a co-panel between Garnik and Seda. I would like to briefly introduce Seda as well, and feel free to have your camera on, Seda, when you're speaking, but it would be wonderful to see you. Seda Manukyan is a researcher at the Matenadaran as well. She specializes in art history and is an expert in Armenian miniature art. Between the years of 2014 and 2013, she worked at the Department of Matenadaran. Her PhD thesis is the similarities between Armenian miniature art and monumental paintings of Cappadocia. To support her research, she collected materials in Cappadocia. Besides at the Matenadaran, she conducted her research at the Catholic University of Louvain and the Oriental Language and Civilization Center in Paris, as well as the Parisian Library. So quite a broad range of collection for her research. Her recent focus has been the illustrated gourd leaves sewn into Armenian manuscripts, particularly from the period of Armenian kingdom of the Bakratunis. So without further ado, I have a very illuminative presentation today between Garnik and Seda. So I would give the transfer the platform to you guys. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Good morning or good evening, everyone. Today I will represent our joint paper, but the work, of course, were done by both of us. Actually, the idea of collecting and analyzing various miniatures of St. Nersēs Shnorhali Armenian manuscripts, my colleague and co-author Seda Manukyan and I had a few years ago. But due to the lack of time and other factors, we were postponing that work, and the present conference dedicated to St. Nersēs Shnorhali became a proper occasion to finally start to fulfill the idea. And in this regard, I would like to thank the organizers, Professor Roberta Erwin, and especially Dr. Ani Manukyan. Thank you, Anijan, for inviting us and to be a part of this important event. And it's very nice to see also familiar faces there, Professor Abraham Terian and Astat Oknakan Serpazan. Nice to meet you. First, I would like to mention, sorry, I should probably share my screen now. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So I would like to underline that the current presentation is the first step towards our main aim, and it is a work in progress. Of course, it is not the first such work, because back in 1977, art historian Astrid Gevorkian published a small article dedicated to various portraits of Nersēs Shnorhali. And recently, in 2023, another international conference dedicated to St. Nersēs Shnorhali was held in the Matenadaran, and our colleague Lucine Sargsyan introduced miniatures of St. Nersēs Shnorhali, which are kept in a collection called Manrus Mung. And also another of our colleague, David Ghazarian, works or presented the paper on Shnorhali's images in Hamail collections, or so-called prayer scrolls. Thus, we tried not to repeat the work which I mentioned. And in this talk, we decided not to concentrate on the life and activities of St. Nersēs Shnorhali in detail, but however, we would like to say or to touch upon some aspects of his life for better understanding of the perception of his person and therefore his image, both by his contemporaries and by later generations. Of course, yesterday Nune and Ted presented us much better images of Rompela. This is a symbolic image, and we know that most of his life, especially after 1150s, when the noble house which Nersēs Shnorhali belonged owned the castle of Rompela, the life of Nersēs Shnorhali was spent there. He became Armenian Catholicos after his brother Grigor, and received his ecclesiastical ranks by his brother, becoming Catholicos of all Armenians after the death of Grigor in 1166. Nersēs Shnorhali can be featured by various epithets, and the sphere of his activities is quite broad. That's why he cannot be featured just as a Catholicos or spiritual pastor or theologian or political figure or a riddle writer. So we should perceive all that together to have the understanding how his image or figure was perceived. He was the most prolific contributor and enricher of liturgical books of Armenian Church, Jamagir and Sharak notes especially, and his Shnorhali's prayer book with Face I Confess, Havatov Fostovanim, has for centuries been one of the most frequently recited prayer book among Armenian believers, probably up to now. And his poem Aravot Luso was taught in schools even during the Soviet period, though he was mostly represented as an author of riddles. And his prayers, particularly Havatov Fostovanim and others, also found their place in so-called Hamails, Upatagiks, which were believed to carry protective or healing functions. In other words, Armenian believers have often raised their prayers to God using the very words of Shnorhali. I will not list other his works, and I will just mention that he is commemorated in the feast of Holy Translators on the Saturday preceding the fifth Sunday of the Feast of Crows, and he is one of the most beloved saints of the Armenian Church. He was buried next to his brother in Horomkala, and his grave remained a major pilgrimage site until the First World War. As noted by Patriarch Shnork Galustian, Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople, he was the 12th and the last Armenian Catholicos canonized as a saint officially by the Church, whose name was included in Donatsuits. We know that there is one exception from the 17th century, the case of Armenian Catholicos Movses Tatevatsi, whose name is found in the Missal or Patarak Hamaduits of the Armenian Church, but is not found in Donatsuits. It was a bit surprising for me to find out that only one story is included in an interesting collection of various legends and stories called Avandapadum, which was compiled by Aram Ghanalanyan. Here he quotes or gives the quote excerpt from Irakos Ganzaketsis' work. I will not read the whole passage. And yesterday, Professor Papazian was talking about Theorianos, and this is the story which is repeated by Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, and in the end he compares Saint Nersēs Shnorhali, calling with Gregory of Nazianzus, calling him New Gregory the theologian. Compared with Hovannes Oznetsi or Grigor Narekatsi, which also were very loved saints of the Armenian Church, it is a surprisingly small amount of like stories, legends, or miraculous stories included in this book. But I'm sure in the future such stories can be found in Armenian manuscripts. Archbishop Shnork Galustian, whom I mentioned, puts in the same line Saint Nersēs Shnorhali with Gregory the Illuminator, Sahak, Mesrop, and Saint Gregory of Narek, calling him being honored not only among Armenians but also in Byzantium. Thus, we can affirm that Saint Nersēs Shnorhali has been among the most beloved saints of the Armenian Church. He was compared with Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory the Illuminator. If we were to describe his persona from the perspective of the medieval Armenian painter, probably two attributes could best define him: wisdom and spirituality or piety. In the collection of Armenian manuscripts at the Matenadaran, named after Mesrop Mashtots, we have identified more than 80 manuscripts in which we can find illuminations, miniatures of Saint Nersēs Shnorhali. In other large collections of the Armenian manuscripts kept in Vienna, Venice and Jerusalem. Also, there are some miniatures of Nersēs Shnorhali, and talking about his works, they are kept in a broader collections, even not large collections containing Armenian manuscripts. So all these collections are going to be studied. Part of them are already studied to define his images in manuscripts. Before moving to the visual part of our presentation, I should apologize for the quality of some pictures which we will show today. I should mention that illustrations of Shnorhali are mostly found in manuscripts containing his own works, which were copied in both separately as a single manuscript and in various collections, Sharak notes, Ganzarans, Manrus monks, and various miscellanies, Jovatsu. And in the collection called Haismavurk or Synaxarium of the Armenian Church, we can find also his image next to the text of his Vita. We will not address the most well-known portraits, such as you can see on the slides now, but instead we will present today lesser known but noteworthy examples of Nersēs Shnorhali's image. Generally, he is depicted in both full-page miniatures along with other figures such as his brother Grigor, and in textual or marginal illustrations. A characteristic feature is the presence of a pastoral staff or a book, usually it is a gospel, in his hand, though this is not a unique feature, and it appears in the iconography of various fathers of the Armenian Church. In all samples known to us, his figure is expressive and dignified. Even in simple outlines, miniaturists tried to convey his qualities as a man of universal intellect. In more richly decorated samples, the image of Shnorhali stands out for the detailed depiction of his episcopal and patriarchal vestments. Especially charming are his portraits, portrayals as a white-haired elder embodying a powerful spiritual presence. It should be noted that in the secondary literature and the catalogs of manuscripts, some miniatures attributed to Nersēs Shnorhali sometimes actually turn out to be depicting not him. The reason for this confusion is that in the history of the Armenian Church, there are at least two more famous Nersesses who are also often found, whose images are also found in the manuscripts. One of them lived many centuries ago, before Nersēs Shnorhali, Saint Nersess the Great, Bartev, and the other Nersess who lived a bit later than Shnorhali, again in Cilician Armenia, Nersess Lambronatsi. That's why here is important to mention the connection between text and image in the example of these two miniatures. On the left miniature, you can see five figures put in medallions, portraits, and I don't think that you will be able to read the inscriptions, but the inscriptions are the following, starting from the left: Sahak, Solomon, Jesus Christos, Christ in the middle. The upper right medallion, unfortunately, is damaged, but surely it should be David there, because it is the beginning of the book of Psalms of David. And the right medallion inscription in the right medallion says Nersēs. So knowing that Nersēs Lambronatsi has authored commentary on Psalms, we can exclude Nersēs Shnorhali's image from in this case. And another very often confusion is with Nersēs Parthev. As I said, here we see a folio from Sharak notes, and the beginning is Kanon Srpu Nersesi Hairapeti, which was sometimes attributed to Nersēs Shnorhali. This Sharakan was authored by Hovannes Yerznkatsi and Armine Serapian, a researcher of this author, states that it is dedicated to Nersēs the Great Parthev. So having this in mind, we should reconsider the authority of these two miniatures, because Astrid Gevorkyan stated that in the left, both attributed to Nersēs Shnorhali, but in reality, in the left, we see the miniature of Jesus Christ, and on the right, a miniature of Nersēs the Great Parthev, again from Sharak notes. Both they are from Sharak notes. Unfortunately, no contemporary portrait of Shnorhali has survived or has been identified thus far. However, we do not exclude that such depictions existed and served as models for later images of St. Nersēs Shnorhali. As of now, the earliest known images of Nersēs Shnorhali date from the 14th century. One notable miniature of this kind is found in the manuscript 2961 of Matenadaran. You can see now. The scribe and illuminator is Mkhitar Anetsi, and the manuscript was copied in 1321. It is a miscellany. Here, Nersēs Shnorhali is not depicted alone. There are two other younger persons opposite him. He is portrayed as a white-bearded elder, and opposite him are two young men, also with halos. And in the manuscript catalog of Matenadaran, the image is labeled as Nersēs Shnorhali and delegates. Unfortunately, Illuminator did not include any textual annotation within or around the miniature. And it is interesting to find another very similar miniature, but not the same. You can see, you can differ them by the maybe the head of the castle in the first miniature. So in the second miniature, the illuminator portrayed Sirach and his disciples. So it is before the beginning of the book of wisdom of Sirach. Generally, they look quite alike, and so we have a guess that those can be either delegates who came to Nersēs Shnorhali, or maybe some of his disciples. A number of other notable examples have come down to us from the 15th century. One of them is found in the manuscript 10,551, which is Manrus Munk, was copied in Amrdolu monastery in 1485. Here, Nersēs Shnorhali is depicted as a full page image, wearing patriarchal garments with a halo. And one distinctive feature is the tilt of his head against the golden arced background. His facial features are small with wide open eyes. The colors of the illustration are damaged, and his patriarchal vestments are rendered in detail. The pallium or yemikoron is especially notable, and its lower part appears lifted. A particularly interesting example comes from the 16th century. It is manuscript 2660 of Matenadaran, again miscellany, copied in 1599 in a village Urvanj near Karin by a scribe and famous illuminator of his time, Arakel Geramatsi. Here is the beginning of the work Նախադրություն խրատական Հաղագս Աղոթից, where Nersēs Shnorhali and his brother Grigor are both depicted together, and the miniature is integrated into the text, both wearing hoods or verars. Seems that the scene illustrates a dialogue between two brothers standing face to face. Interestingly, one more miniature of St. Nersēs Shnorhali is found in the same manuscript, but here Nersēs is alone with similar vestments as on the previous miniature. The text here is the beginning of his famous prayer Havatov Khostovan. Another manuscript of Matenadaran 2377 is not dated but is dated by 16th century. Again, this is a miscellany, and the miniature is put before the work Jesus' Son, Jesus Vorti. Here again, Nersēs Shnorhali is depicted in patriarchal liturgical vestments, performing the blessing gesture, the Diarnagrov gestov, with a book in his hand, and an especially large group of depictions of Shnorhali from the 17th century have survived, which can largely be explained by the greater number of manuscripts preserved from that period. The available examples are sufficient to demonstrate that Shnorhali's works and images were widely popular among Armenians, regardless of the era. In Matenadaran manuscript 504, which is dated by 1638 and was copied in Constantinople by scribe Astvatsadur of Amasya, probably. This one is actually fascinating miniature because Shnorhali is depicted looking out from a balcony, which with the architectural background, dressed in episcopal garments, and going back to the connection of text and image, a person who just knows generally the works of Nersēs Shnorhali probably can guess which work will contain such illumination. And if you are now thinking about the general letter or ecumenical epistle of Nersēs Shnorhali, then you are right. And this is put before Utuntandrakan. Nersēs, below him is a crowd of people gathered, and some people are gazing up at Shnorhali, while others appear to be looking towards the heavens. And among the crowd, a few figures stand out with unusual turban-like hats, and we can guess that the miniaturist depicted clothing contemporary to him in Constantinople. Another manuscript of Matenadaran 1502 contains the image of Shnorhali, and this is his Vita. The manuscript is Haismavurk, dated by 1651, again copied in Constantinople. These are two various examples. On the right, you can see Nersēs Shnorhali, and on the left side, Grigor Vkayaser. In case of both figures, we can see that Yemiporon or pallium seems to be like a double, because one layer is lifted by his hand, by the hand with which he holds the gospel, and the continuation of another seems to be another Yemiporon is seen. So this phenomenon we can see in other manuscripts as well. And we don't have a final answer to this. Maybe one of them can be Porurar and another Yemiporon. But as I know, at least now, bishops usually wear Yemiporon only. Another interesting detail here in the case of Nersēs Shnorhali are the presence of two other books next to him. This will be repeated later. I will show the same in another miniature. Before that, we can go to another interesting manuscript numbered 1558, which is Miscellany, copied in 1643, where two images of Nersēs Shnorhali can be found. And on folio 3 verso, he is depicted with particularly expressive features dominated by black tones. His halo is outlined in red, and he is shown blessing with his right hand and holding a book in left hand. He wears liturgical vestments, including mantle and pallium, decorated with triple armed crosses. And the miniature of Shnorhali precedes his poetic work, Bank Chapav. On the other folio, on the right side, Shnorhali appears holding a staff. From upper right corner, the hand of God is seen, and it appears that the miniaturist matched the color of his garments to the background, which is notable visual choice in this case. This miniature is put before his poem Havato Prostovami. Another miniature from 17th century, from 1661, is found in Jamagirk, which includes Shnorhali's image. Interestingly, this image appears not at the beginning of the text of the work, but in a full-page miniature in the text. The image differs significantly from previously known depictions. Shnorhali is set against a background decorated with gold and geometrical patterns. The monumental body as a small head create a sense of distorted proportions, which is characteristic for the 17th century depictions of saints and clerics. He is shown wearing pallium and with a halo, and seems that his facial expression expresses sadness. In another manuscript of Matenadaran, on the right part, 10,961, Shnorhali is portrayed in a marginal miniature wearing verar and Yemiporon. This is a simplified rendering, which becomes increasingly dominant from the 18th century onward, especially in Hamail style depiction of Shnorhali. Another interesting manuscript known to us is dated by 17th century, around 1622. The scribe is Hovannes Mokatsi. Here Shnorhali is shown within an ark, and above him, in a tripartite apse, are the three persons of the Holy Trinity. The manuscript contains various works by Shnorhali, and the miniature in question appears to be before the work titled Confession of Faith by Nersess, So depiction of Holy Trinity before a dogmatic work of Nersēs Shnorhali is again stressing this connection of text and image. By the 18th century, depictions of Shnorhali exhibit simpler stylistic treatment, a reflection of the period and its technical limitations. In Matenadaran manuscript 7825, which is Jambagirk, dated by 1714, copied in Kaffa, Crimea, Shnorhali is shown in patriarchal vestments, wearing again pallium, which is adorned with crosses. He holds a staff, leaning against his left arm, and a manuscript in his right hand. His facial features are rendered schematically, while his vestments are richly colored. Particularly notable is his tiara, or huir in Armenian, divided at the top into two parts with two crosses. And of course, we know this structure of tiaras, but the interesting detail is that the tiara is shown at a slightly angle rather than head-on, unlike the image of Shnorhali, which is depicted like from the front. Another 18th century example is found in manuscript 1533. This is again Haismavurk or Synaxarium, and this miniature is in the text of his Vita. The illuminators of the manuscripts are Jacob and Harutun Hovnatanyans, and it was copied between 1725 and 1730. Again, we can see two books besides the one Nersēs Shnorhali holds in his hand, and art historian Astrid Gevorkian considered that in this way the painter stressed Shnorhali or tried to portray Shnorhali as a scholar. We suppose that the miniaturist sought to emphasize Shnorhali's vast literary legacy and prolific pen. By the 19th century, the depictions of Shnorhali that have reached us become much more schematic and simplified, as in the manuscript you can see now, which is Upatagirk, copied in 1822 by scribe Mkhitar. The content is again Havato Khostovani. To conclude, the miniatures of Nersēs Shnorhali preserved in Armenian manuscripts appear across a wide range of manuscripts, either accompanying his various works or his Vita. The geographic spread as well as the chronology of these manuscript copies are also notably diverse. These miniatures, created both by renowned miniaturists and anonymous painters, exhibit significant variation in several aspects. Placement in the manuscript, we saw full-page illustrations or text-integrated miniature or marginal illustrations, and also they vary in the depiction of the figure. In the majority of cases, the saint is portrayed alone. However, a group scenes also exist where he appeared with his brother or with other figures, either delegates or disciples, or in front of the crowd. And his vestments and ecclesiastical rank vary significantly. Some images present him in more formal episcopal or patriarchal clothing, while others depict him more simply, possibly as a monk or ascetic. Some questions related to these garments are planned for further exploration in future research to offer more precise conclusions. During the preparation of this report, we also received miniatures from the Mekhitarist congregation of Vienna, their collection. for which we are very grateful. And we would also like to thank the Directorate of the Matenadaran and our colleagues from the Department of Digitization of Matenadaran. However, we will address those along with images preserved in other collections in the future studies. I hope that we could present the general features of depiction of Saint Nersēs Shnorhali through several centuries and some connections between text and image, both in manuscripts containing his works and his vita preserved in Haismavu. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.
It's beautiful. Very much enjoyed the illuminative, the power of the image, or what it is able to contribute to us. So we'll reserve questions for discussion after Jesse's paper, which is an honor to introduce Dr. Jesse Arlen, who is the director of the Krikur and Clara Zorab Information Center at the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church in America and a postdoctoral researcher fellow at Fordham University. He earned his PhD in 2021 from UCLA. It was an honor to study alongside Jesse around those times on the life and literary works of the 10th century monastic abbot Ananya of Narek, Ananya Narekadze. He has many scholarly publications related to medieval monastic literature and intellectual history. He has taught classical Armenian at various institutions, including the University of Notre Dame, the Dumbarton Oaks Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, Himmel, the summer school program, which he will also be doing this summer. Congratulations on that. St. Nersēs Armenian Seminary here with us. He currently teaches classical Armenian and through the Zorab Center, in addition to hosting private classes. Recent publications include the article Writing for Laity in Competition with Gusan, St. Nersēs Shnorhali's Poetic Invention into the Armenian Literary Tradition. If I may ask Armina to mute your mic, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. We've had tech problems that very, very much relate to it. So absolutely no need to apologize. Thank you. St. Nersēs, so Shnorhali Poetics Intervention into Armenian Literary Tradition in the St. Nersēs Theological Review, which many of us will actually publish for these publication, the proceedings of this conference. And he has co-authored a book with Matthew Sarkisian, who is actually joining us also today. The book, Odes of St. Nersēs the Graceful, annotated and translated, published with the Tarkmanial Press in 2024. Jesse, without further ado, it's an honor to introduce a friend, a colleague, and also someone who I've studied with and learned very much side by side. Thank you. Please.
Well, I want to start by thanking everyone that made this conference possible, the host institution, and in particular, just want to name and thank Dean Shahinyan and Dr. Ani Shahinyan and Professor Roberta Irving, who put so much work into making this conference possible. It means so much to all of us, especially to be able to gather together here in person with friends and colleagues and professors and doctoral advisors. So my talk is entitled Time, Place, and Context in the Odes of St. Nersēs. So a collection of 102 odes, depending on how they're counted, Dach, along with 9 spurious ones, are found among the poetic and liturgical compositions of St. Nersēs Shnorhali. Before Shnorhali, we know of only one odist in the Armenian tradition, St. Gregory of Narek, of whom there are some 30 odes extant. Indeed, Shnorhali's own odes are modeled on those of the Narekian saint, while introducing certain innovations, in particular by expanding the scope of topics treated. In this contribution to Shnorhali and his context, I would like to unpack how the impact of the particular time, place, and context in which Shnorhali was active may be seen in his collection of odes, which otherwise treat timeless and eternal subject matter belonging to the realm of liturgical worship. As alluded to already, the liturgical genre now known as ode, in Armenian dav, was developed at the monastery of Nadek in the late 10th century, principally by Saint Gregory, who along with this innovation is credited with the development of other liturgical chant genres, such as gans, often translated litany. Nadek Monastery was founded in the 930s under the sponsorship of King Gagik Artsruni, not far from the king's own palace at Bostan, when the Artsrunid kingdom of Vaspuragan was at the apogee of its prestige and influence. During this period, the Catholicosate, ever attracted to the center of political power for protection, security, and influence, had migrated from Devin to Akhtamar, where it took up temporary residence for some 20 years before relocating north to Ardina to reside under the protection of the Bagratid kings. Nadek Monastery was founded during a period of fecund building activity that spanned some 200 years, from the second half of the 9th to the first half of the 11th century, thanks to the sponsorship of the Bagratid, Artsrunid, and Sunid dynasties, which flourished at this time. Many of the new monastic foundations built in the 10th century are memorialized by historian Stepanos Dadonetsi, who devotes several chapters in his universal history to the characteristics of each and the charisma and renown of their abbots and famous holy men. Nadek's first abbot was Anania, cousin of St. Gregory's mother, whom Stepanos calls a great philosopher, Philisopine Meds, a term which in this period denoted not just a scholar and thinker, but one skilled in ecclesiastical music. Indeed, when commenting on the characteristics of Nadek Monastery, Stepanos says that Nadek Avank was renowned for multi-talented singers who added brilliance to worship and learned scholars. Thanks to the stability and permanence in the new endowed foundations of this period, monasteries such as Nadek enjoyed the luxury of being able to devote much more time and attention to communal worship. Adding brilliance to this worship was one of the responsibilities entrusted to St. Gregory of Nadek, as attested by his festal works, recently translated and commented upon by Professor Abraham Terion, which were composed to enrich the feast day services celebrated in the monastery. The odes belong to this context and purpose, written to enhance and beautify the worship on the major feast days of the liturgical calendar. And Dr. Shahinian, I don't know if you have the slides that I shared, if you could pull up the first one. So we can see the list of odes that St. Gregory of Nadek wrote, which cover 10 different topics, which basically cover most of the major feasts in the liturgical calendar. So there's 4 for Theophany Nativity, 1 for the presentation of the Lord in the temple, 3 for the 40 martyrs of Sebastia and other holy martyrs, or 2, raising of Lazarus, Easter, Ascension, Pentecost, Feast of the Church, covering a few different feasts, Transfiguration, and Feast of the Cross. So with that in mind, let's take just a brief interlude to talk about the word ode or dav and the genre it refers to. So we should note that dav is not a title given to these works by either Gregory or Nersēs, who instead tended to call them yerk, song. We see this in the acrostics that they wrote for their odes. So rather, the term dav is found later among the manuscript titles to these works, many of which are extant in manuscripts bearing the title davaran, ode book or collection of odes. The word dav, as used by Nersēs Shnorhali and other writers, signifies first and foremost a metrical composition, or a song composed in a fixed meter. This is important, especially for their performance setting, which is communal, probably antiphonal worship in a monastery. So the same melody can be consistently sung over the successive lines, thanks to the consistent syllable count of those lines. Like the genres of Sharagan and Gutsurt, to which dav bears some connection, this genre is an extension of the especially monastic practice of chanting the Psalms. While the psalms to be chanted on a given feast day may be chosen to align with the theme of that day, which we see in the Jamakirk, the psalms are historically speaking the hymn book of the ancient Israelites and bear only typological or hermeneutical connection with Christian feast days. To fulfill this lack, the genres of Sharagan, Gutsurt, Yerk, and Dag were developed and arranged at their corresponding places in the daily liturgical services to make the Christian understanding of the feast day more explicit than the words of the Psalms could do on their own, and to reflect further on the mystery and meaning of the feast day being celebrated or the saints being commemorated. With the use of the English word ode to translate Dag, which is just a transliteration of the Greek ode, the noun from the verb aido, to sing. We should not think, of course, of the modern lyric genre known from romantic poets like John Keats, but rather the usage of this word in reference to the biblical odes, the collection of 20-odd psalm-like songs and canticles of Old and New Testaments found in books other than the Book of Psalms, and like the Psalms, commonly used in Christian liturgical worship. Likewise, also the late antique Odes of Solomon, which has been called the earliest Christian hymn book. Being then liturgical compositions, the odes have a particular conception of time. Many of them are written in the present tense, with the word today often appearing. For example, Aisod avediats caprieli lurumen, Yerani arguis Mariam, Aisod anerpin inam sian ajmam, Arlitzial harkanti gusin. Today, the fulfillment of Gabriel's good news to the Virgin Mary comes about. Today, the timeless one's 9-month term of growth in the Virgin's womb is completed. For an ode for Jodakaluit's nativity vigil. The odes operate according to the logic of liturgical time, which Father Alexander Schmemann called eschatologically transparent. All times are present at once in the here and now, just as they are to the Lord of time. The events of the Bible or early Christian period commemorated in the various odes are not represented as having happened long ago, but right now, as it were, on this very day, in which the celebrants stand together and sing. Those celebrating the feast by chanting the odes inhabit the same present reality as the salvific events of which they sing and of the Lord to whom they sing. Podkez Jesus, Adaroch Eiser Hashtusyan, Kev Hamatzanyal Antier Gnainotzen, Yer Kemkes Podis. Glory to you, O Jesus, maker of this reconciliation. Through you, in harmony with the heavenly ones, we sing glory. Those singing the odes, the monks chanting in monasteries, stand, as it were, in heaven, and sing the odes in unison with the companies of the watchers, the vigilant angels, whose praise echoes eternally as they stand ever wakeful in the presence of the timeless divine being. With this understanding in mind, one would not necessarily expect to find much in the way of influence from Shnorhali's own time and context in the content of the odes. Nevertheless, comparison of Nersess's collection of odes with St. Gregory's yields fruitful insights. The next slide. Like the previous list, here is a list of the topics treated and the number of odes written on each theme. It's so long it can't even all fit on the screen, so you can just scroll up and down a little. So when we take a closer look at this list, the first thing we notice is a significant increase in the number of topics or feast days that Nersess wrote odes for, 28 compared to 10 for Gregory. In general, Nersess also composed more odes for each feast day. For example, for Theophany Nativity, Gregory wrote 4, Nersess wrote 25. For Easter, Gregory wrote 4, Nersess wrote 15. The multiplicity of odes written for each feast day attests to the great creativity in liturgical worship that was a characteristic of this period. The same songs were not necessarily sung every year, but a new one could be composed for the occasion. Likewise, if we look at the manuscript titles of some of the odes, we see that certain odes were applied, at least in local usage, for one of the 8 days in the octave of celebration following major feast days. For example, the odes written for Nativity by Shnorhali are arranged according to some manuscripts for the 8-day celebration of the feast, with 1 to 2 odes dedicated to each day of the octave, plus the vigil. Or, as in the case of the resurrection odes for Easter, the various ones in the collection are written based on the various gospel accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and presumably may have been sung at a point in the services when the resurrection account from each gospel was read, or after it was read. As with the repertoire of Sharagan hymns, which Nersēs greatly expanded as a result of the many new saints' days integrated into the liturgical calendar, thanks in large part to the work of his predecessor, Catholicos Grigor Vagaioser, who translated many new saints' lives into Armenian in the century preceding Nersēs. So also Nersēs greatly expanded the repertoire of odes for feast days in the calendar. So we see new ones for Palm Sunday, the major days of Holy Week preceding Easter, Assumption, feast days that at least ones we have from St. Gregory don't cover. Likewise, for saints' days, he penned odes for categories of saints, such as apostles, prophets, martyrs, etc., as well as for specific saints, St. John the Baptist, Sons of Thunder, St. Anthony, etc. But what I think is very striking in the collection and the list is at the very bottom. If we look, we find these Armenian saints from the 4th century, St. Gregory the Illuminator, St. Nersess the Great, St. Hripsime and her companions, and St. Turdot the King. So why this new focus? It was a new focus in this period. From our perspective in the 21st century, it seems, of course, odes on these figures, but this was a new development in this period. Why this new focus on 4th century saints of Arsasid Armenia in 12th century Kilikia, Cilicia? The answer comes to us when we take a closer look into the time, place, and context of Nersēs, and in particular when we understand the self-representation of the Pahlavuni family to which Nersēs belonged, and which dominated the Catholicosate for a century and a half, from 1066 to 1203, with 7 successive incumbents from the same Pahlavuni clan on the Catholicosal throne. And Professor Terian talked about this a bit yesterday. So Grigor Vagaioser, 1066-1105, Barsag of Kilikia, Gregory III, Nersess's older brother, 1113 to 1166, St. Nersess himself, right in the middle of this list of 7, Gregory IV, Gregory V, Gregory VI is the last in the line. So notably, when we look at this list, all 7 Catholicoi bear the name of renowned 4th century church fathers, Krikor, Barsel, Basil, and Nersess, with the name Gregory used 5 of the 7 times. And notably also for the first time since Gregory the Illuminator. There hadn't been any Gregory since until Grigor Vagaioser again. Quite vividly, the Pahlavuni were hearkening back to the 4th, 5th century Gregorid dynasty of Arsasid, Arshakuni Catholicoi from St. Gregory the Illuminator to Sahak the Great, who were of course related to the ruling house of the Arshakuni kings and whose respective dynasties ended in the same year, 428. In his first literary work, which we heard a little bit about yesterday also, the poetic epic known as the Vibasanutun, Epic History, written around 1121 while he was still in his teenage years, and while his older brother Grigor sat the Catholicosal throne. Nersēs highlights his Pahlavuni family's claim as descendants of the Arshakuni kings and Catholicoi of old. The more lengthy manuscript title to this work makes this clear. So he says, it's called Composition in Homeric Epic Verse Concerning the Armenian People and the Arshakuni House, from the beginning to the end, composed by Nersēs, brother of Catholicos of Armenia, Lord Gregory, for his own ancestors, written during the days of his youth. This work involves a history of Armenia from the mythical past, interwoven together with the biblical narrative, a la Nersēs Shnorhali, but extending the narrative all the way down to Nersess's own day in 12th century Kilikia, with a pronounced focus on the role of his own family, the Pahlavuni, and their claimed ancestors, the Arshakuni, including most prominently both the dynasty of kings and Catholicoi of the 4th and 5th centuries. Much space in this work of 1,594 lines is given over to the first Gregorid dynasty of Catholicoi. Remember, he's covering from creation to his own day, millennia of time. But the beginning of the Illuminator's story with Khosrov and Anak starts on line 362, and to the death of Sahak, line 975, it's 614 lines, 40% of the entire work, just to those 2 centuries. The reader's attention is meant to focus here, perceiving it as the pinnacle of Armenia's millennia-old historical past. Much space is given to detail the stories of the Illuminators, Saint Hripsime, Catholicos Nersess the Great, Sahak, and the other major figures of the 4th and 5th century. What this does is this makes the end of the Arshakuni dynasty of Catholikoian kings all the more dramatic and lamentable in the context of his history. We see the line here. Dasil serpuin askadaryal, takyev hoviv hayots partial, zor napor dampen yetsuit saldial, yet boski gadavo zadskial. The vision of the saint, this is Saint Sahak, was here fulfilled. Crown and shepherd of Armenia were removed, which he showed with the folded cloak and the golden globe covered with cloth. These maybe somewhat cryptic lines are a reference to the vision of Sahak as recounted in the history of Ghazar Barpatsi, foreseeing the end of the dynasties of Arshakuni kings and Catholicoi, represented through the symbol of crown and shepherd, cloak and globe. In contrast to this section of the work, 4th and 5th centuries, which is painted with the fairest brushstrokes, the next period, the so-called interregnum of almost 400 years, until the rise of the Bagratuni kings in the 9th century, is covered in less than 50 lines, with almost no space given to any of the literary, architectural, or religious flourishing that occurred in that period. Instead, it is portrayed as almost unilateral hardship and oppression under Sasanian and then Arab rule. The Bagratid period, widely acknowledged as one of flourishing on many fronts, is given just 18 lines. Nersēs does not name even a single Bagratid or Arturinid king, before the Seljuk Turks are already coming out of their uninhabitable Hanabade land and ravishing the Armenian realm, leading to devastation and exile. And I think I have the quotes for this on the next slide. I hashchared zenantian yelial, I hayden yats dara merjial, hergir odar bantachtatsial, minchsi is meren moratial. Zashcharen mer odark gerial, mer arachia chatstasial. We have left the land of our birth, exiled from our fatherland, become sojourners in a strange land, so long that we have forgotten our own. Foreigners devoured our realm before our own eyes. And then right here, Nersēs returns to the theme of crown and shepherd and has this to say. First about the Catholicosal throne, the next quote, Ani, if you just scroll down. Nachnin ator, that one. Nachnin ator hor Luis Zakial, Aini Miki Gahavarial, Atora Galkan Heratial, Darash Harik Sherchakayal. The ancient throne on which light dawned now stands shrouded in mist. Its incumbents have gone far off, roaming about in distant lands. This refers to the instability and peripatetic state of the Catholicosal See, which left Divine in the turmoil of the early 10th century, migrated south to Vasfuragan, then north to Argina, and subsequently Ani in the Bagratid realm, before migrating once more after the Byzantine conquest and Seljuk invasions in the second half of the 11th century. Immediately following these lines, we have another quatrain where Nersēs refers to the royal house, but it seems he has in mind not the recently reigning Bagratuni kings, to which he's given almost no attention, but the Arshakuni kings, the ancestors of his own Pahlavuni family. Dohm, Bortaki Paravorial, Anarjanits Astrugial, Bork Ashcharatz Pazmatstirial, ikach tzalot hatzmodatio. The house that gloried in a crown has become a slave of the unworthy. Those who ruled many realms beg for bread from the hungry. All this is, of course, a setup for the rise of the Pahlavuni, who amidst this portrayal of devastation, destruction, loss, and exile, rise like a phoenix from the ashes of the conquered realm. Nersess's narrative perspective moves from the telescopic back to the microscopic as he begins narrating the rise of the Pahlavuni through the figures of Vasak Pahlavuni and his son Grigor Magistros, the latter the great-grandfather of Nersēs Shnorhali and father of the first Pahlavuni Catholicos, Grigor Vagayaser. The election to the Catholicosal throne of Vagayaser is seen as a restoration of the rightful ruler upon the throne, and is contrasted sharply with the preceding dynasty of Catholicoi that lasted some 100 years, with interruption from Anania Mokatsi to Chachig Anatsi, middle 10th to middle 11th century, about whom Nersess has little good to say, comparing them with the Old Testament aged priest Eli, whose profligate sons are the negative foil to the good prophet Samuel. Likewise, in contrast with his predecessors, Krikor Vagayaser, the first of the Pahlavuni Catholicoi, is called a new Aaron, adorned with mitre, and Samuel, dedicated to the Lord, revealed to us as a second Mesrop, Nor Aharon, yet Samvel Diaran Anzayel, Irgrot Mesrop Mez Yerevyel. In other words, the rise of Krikor Vagayaser, the establishment of the Pahlavuni clan upon the throne, is considered a return of the glory days of the 4th and 5th century, here in exile in Kilikia. Doesn't matter. From here, Nersess proceeds with granular detail to narrate the reigns of his Pahlavuni predecessors in rosy hues before coming to an end with his young and lowly Gerdser Navastatsial self, with which he ends it. So, as is evident from this summary, the epic history can be very fruitfully read, among other ways, as a form of Pahlavuni family PR, or propaganda, which hailed the establishment of the Pahlavuni dynasty of Catholicoi on the ecclesiastical throne as the remedy for the loss of kingship and exile from the traditional homeland in the previous period. Indeed, the Pahlavuni dynasty represented a form of stability and connection with the Armenian past after the rupture of the previous age and relocation to Kilikia. The Bagratid dynasty, with its capital at Ani, ended in 1045, when Gagik II ceded his kingdom to the Byzantines, followed by Bagratid king Gagik Abbas ceding Gars in 1065. Kingship didn't return, officially until Reuben ad Levon I in 1198. So between these years, essentially, were dominated by the Pahlavuni Catholicoi, basically spanning these exact dates, 1066 to 1203, who represented themselves as a force of continuity with the distant Armenian past through their connection with the Arshakuni kings on the one hand, and especially the Arshakuni Catholicoi, from Gregory the Illuminator to Sahak the Great. The pronounced attention given to these figures of 4th and 5th century Armenia in Shnorhali's epic history, as well as his collection of odes, of course, is meant to bolster the position of his own family in 12th century Kilikia. In other words, the more he heightens the prestige of Saints Gregory, Nersess the Great, King Durdot, and others of the 4th century to whom the Pahlavuni claimed descent, the more the prestige of his own family's position would be bolstered in the eyes of their contemporaries in Kilikia, and their security on the throne solidified. This explains the special effort in the odes to celebrate and bring attention to King Durdot, Saint Srepsime and her companions, Gregory the Illuminator, Saint Nersess the Great, who are among only a very few individual saints to whom specific odes were dedicated. When Catholicos Nersess, at the outset of one of his odes, and here's the last slide, Ani. So just very briefly, because we're running out of time, just to look at a couple small selections. If you scroll up just a little bit, Ani. If you scroll up before, yeah, right there. So just to look at a couple of the odes on Gregory the Illuminator. So He refers, when Catholicos Nersēs calls him our father, he not only means the spiritual father of the Armenian people, but is subtly reminding his flock and all singing the odes about the genealogical connection between himself, his brother Catholicos Grigor III, and Saint Gregory the Illuminator. This is the start of this ode. Srov peit saini yaranagam kaisor, ihishadagi hor rapun mero. With the voice of seraphim, we chant today in remembrance of our rabbi, father, or teacher, father. Or in another ode to the Illuminator, when he refers to we sons born from you, he means not just all Armenian Christians whom Saint Gregory begat as spiritual father, but also quite literally himself and his Pahlavani family members sitting on the Catholicosal throne. Krikorios, ikenzanyal vortikas, aisor miatsain yaranagam kes, urachlej, surpaj, ishadagi kodonas. Gregory, we sons born from you, today chant to you with one voice. Rejoice, Holy Father, on this feast in remembrance of you. In such ways can we fruitfully read the odes of Saint Nersess today, those timeless works of liturgical worship, and yet still hear the resonant influences of Nersess's own context, time, and place on these immortal works. Thank you.
I would like to introduce Rachel and say a couple of her words to us today. Being very apologetic for not being able to be present with us. Again, let me first introduce Rachel and then I'll read her paper. Thank you. Rachel Zanon is an art historian, currently a research fellow at the University Paris. I can't even pronounce the university, so I probably will not be speaking Italian, in Siena. Dr. Zanon obtained her PhD in history, territory, and cultural heritage at the University of Roma. Her thesis focused on the Vaspuragan medieval Armenian miniature paintings, 13th to 14th centuries. After her PhD, she held a postdoctoral fellowship with the ERC project entitled Armenia Entangled, Collectivity and Cultural Encounters in Medieval Eurasia, 9th to 14th centuries. She was awarded as a fellow at, let's see, Fondazione?
I'm not following, Sean.
Yes,
Fondazione.
Fondazione Centro Study, where she developed a project focused on the study of ornamental expression in non-European art with a focus on artifacts from China, Japan, and Islamic Middle East. Rachel's paper is entitled Spiritual Images Through His Word, Saint Nersēs Shnorhali and the Illuminated Art of the Armenian Gospel. A very brief note from Rachel. She says, "Dear colleagues and friends, it is with these few lines that I sincerely apologize for not being present at this wonderful conference dedicated to the figure of Saint Nersēs Shnorhali. My sincere thanks to the organizers, Dr. Roberta Irvin and Ani Shahinian, for extending this valuable invitation to me. Unfortunately, the dates coincide with a conflict that arose very recently, and I'm sorry not to be with you. I am wholeheartedly looking forward to hearing your fascinating presentations soon on the official stream on St. Nersess Seminary's website. I will also be glad to send my contributions for publication." The medieval Armenian illuminated manuscript tradition stands as a testament to the harmonious fusion of theology and art. Central to this tradition is Saint Nersēs Shnorhali, a theologian and a poet whose theological insights profoundly influenced the visual culture of his time. His works, particularly his commentaries on the Gospels, provided a theological framework that illuminated the purpose and interpretation of illuminated manuscript. This paper explores the relationship between Saint Nersēs Shnorhali's theology and the medieval Armenian miniature, focusing on the interplay between text and image and how theological concepts were visually manifested in manuscript illumination. Shnorhali was a prominent figure in the Armenian church, renowned for his theological writings and hymns. Educated at Armid Bang, Red Monastery, he was deeply influenced by the monastic tradition that emphasized the interpretation of the Word of God. His theological approach was characterized by a profound engagement with Scripture, seeking to uncover the spiritual and symbolic meanings within the biblical text. Nersēs Shnorhali contributed significantly to Armenian theological reflection, emphasizing beauty as the path to understanding the divine. His theological vision was reflected in liturgy, poetry, and indirectly in art. His influence can be felt in the iconography of the Armenian Bible codices of the time, particularly in miniature schools of Cilicia active between the 12th and 14th centuries. These manuscripts often incorporated elements of Nersess's theology, such as the centrality of the divine mystery and the importance of the church as a community for salvation. One of the significant contributions was his commentary on the Gospel of St. Matthew, where he interpreted the canon tables, illuminated pages that preceded the Gospel text, as a preparatory tools for spiritual contemplation. He viewed these tables not merely as decorative elements, but as integral to the liturgical and theological experience of the reader. According to Nersess, these illuminated pages served as, and quote, bath of sight and hearing, unquote, cleansing the senses and preparing the soul for the sacred mysteries contained within the gospel text. He emphasized that the beauty and the complexity of these images were not distraction, but aided in elevating the mind towards divine contemplation. In medieval Armenia, illuminated manuscripts were not only repositories of knowledge, but also active participants in the theological and liturgical life of the church. The illumination of manuscripts was a sacred art form, which each image and color chosen for its theological significance. The canon tables were adorned with symbolic representations of biblical themes, such as the Ark of Noah, the Tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies. These images were designed to invoke contemplation and to connect the viewer with the divine narrative. The theological underpinnings of these illuminations were deeply influenced by Saint Nersēs Shnorhali's writings. His interpretations provided a theological framework that guided artists in their depiction of sacred themes. For instance, his emphasis on the number 10 as a symbol of completeness and divine order is reflected in the structure of the canon tables, which are organized in 10 sections, each corresponding to a different theological concept. The interplay of text and image. The relationship between text and image in Armenian illuminated manuscripts is a dynamic interplay where each element enhances the understanding of the other. The text provides the theological and liturgical context, while the images offer a visual representation that aids in the interpretation and the internalization of the text. This synergy is evident in the canon tables, where the illuminated images serve as a visual introduction to the gospel readings, encapsulating the theological themes that will be explored in the text. Illuminated canon tables were thus not neutral. They are architectural, often temple-like framing alluded to the heavenly Jerusalem and the unity of the divine revelation. Through columns and the arches bearing the evangelists, which are symbolized as the lion, the ox, men, and eagle, these images visualize the concordance of the Gospels, a harmony that Shnorhali also sought in his ecclesiastical writings. In the canon table, colors, shapes, and motifs were carefully chosen for their spiritual significance. For example, the use of red, green, black in the canon tables was not arbitrary, but carried significant theological meaning. Red symbolized the blood of Christ and the martyrs, but carried significant theological meanings. I actually double read a sentence there, so my apologies. Red symbolizes the blood of Christ and the martyrs. Green represented life and resurrection. Black denoted the divine mystery, and blue signified the heaven. The peacock symbolizes resurrection and immortality. The rooster heralds the divine light, the coming of the divine light. The monkeys with lit candles symbolize the church, while those with unlit candles represent the Temple of Solomon, now replaced by the church as the abode of the Godhead. Floral motifs such as the date, palm tree, olive tree, lilies, pomegranates were all imbued with symbolic meanings. The date tree or the palm tree represented the lofty nature and blessings of the angels. The olive tree symbolized the longevity of the patriarchs. The lily denoted purity, patience, and the pomegranate signified the sweetness of the new law within the bitter rid of the Old Testament. These symbolic elements were not merely decorative, but served to reinforce the theological message conveyed in the texts themselves. They provided visual language that contemplated the written word, creating a multi-sensory experience that engaged the viewer in contemplation of the divine. Shnorhali's view on iconography was nuanced and reflective of the theological debate of his time. He acknowledged the veneration of icons within the Armenian church, but emphasized that the honor due to the image was directed towards the prototype it represented. He states, "We accept them, we bow down before the image of our Savior, we respect them. We respect the images of all the saints, each one according to his rank or to their ranks. We represent them in our churches and on our sacred vestments, but the same honor is not due to the representation of Christ or of the cross or of those the saints. We honor and glorify the image of the saint, who are our intermediaries and our intercessors before God. Proskismus, veneration, proskismus is offered to God through them, for it is only due to the Creator and not to the created." Central to Shnorhali's theology is the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh. For him, the incarnation is the axis around which the Christian thought turned, and the views shape how sacred texts and images interact. Just as Christ is the visible image of the invisible God, Colossians 1:15, so too can images can present that which is spiritually hidden. In his theological writings and hymns, Shnorhali frequently speaks of God's nemanutzium, emphasizing the way divinity humbles itself to be seen, heard, or touched. This incarnational principle legitimizes and even demands sacred art. In the Armenian manuscript illuminations, especially in the depictions of the Nativity, baptism, transfiguration, images reflect not only the event, but the theological truths about divine presence and transformation. Shnorhali's understandings of icons and manuscript illuminations as vessels of divine grace mirror the Eastern Christian conviction that art is not merely an ornamentation, but a theological act. Biblical imagery in Armenian manuscripts, under the influence of Shnorhali's theological vision, became a symbolic language. This can be seen in this iconography of the key events, such as here on slide number 5, the Nativity, often depicted in a cave, reflecting early Christian Syriac influence, but imbued with Shnorhali's emphasis on paradox. The infinite born in poverty. The cave, dark and humble, becomes the womb of divine light. His theological reflection emphasizes how, In Christ, God becomes accessible to men not only in his divinity, but also in his humanity. This divine word, which before was transcendent and inaccessible, now takes on human form in the person of Jesus Christ. In Nersess's thinking, the nativity is also a tangible sign of God's love for humanity. God, who is infinitely great and distant, stoops to the human condition, is born as a frail and vulnerable child, is humble in a humble stable to share suffering and bring salvation. The God who becomes man, who is born among the poor, is adored by the shepherds and recognized by the magi, becomes a model for humility and hope. An important aspect of Nersess's theological reflection on the nativity is the symbolism of light. Like other Christian traditions, Armenian theology sees the nativity as the arrival of the divine light into the world. Christ is described as the light of the world, and his birth brings with it a new hope that illuminates the darkness of sin and death. Armenian miniatures, which often depict the nativity, express his light through the symbolism of the child or through the adoration of the shepherds approaching to him. In one of his prayers, Nersess writes, "Light that shines in darkness, come and shine in our souls. You who are the Son of righteousness, you who enlighten every man who come into the world, come and restore hope to the afflicted." Finally, Nersess insists on the concept of humility that pervades the nativity event. God, the creator of the universe, chooses to be born in humility and poverty, not in royal palaces, but in the stable among animals. And his first bed is a manger. In one of his Eastern hymns, Shnorhali writes, "You who are the king of the universe were born in poverty to teach us humility. By your birth, you elevated our nature, lowered in sin." Shnorhali viewed Christ's passion not only as a moment of suffering, but as the ultimate act of divine love and self-emptying kenosis. His poetic theology often interprets the cross as a tree of life, a paradoxical throne of glory and humility, and the bridge between humanity and God. Miniatures from Cilician manuscripts often include Old Testament characters, Moses striking the rock or Isaac carrying the wood, directly illustrating Shnorhali's poetic approach that reads the Old Testament in light of the cross. In Armenian manuscript illuminations, the crucifixion reflects these theological themes with striking clarity. Christ is typically shown serene and triumphant on the cross, emphasizing his divinity rather than agony, echoing Shnorhali's understanding of the crucifixion as victory through love. Often flanked by Mary and John, with the sun and moon personified above, the image conveys cosmic significance. Symbolic details such as the Golgotha depicted as a skull or Adam's burial site visualize the idea of redemption extending back to the first human. These images are not merely illustrated, but theological icons shaped by the same vision that guided Shnorhali's writings. The cross as the axis of divine mercy and human transformation. The concept of passion occupies a central place in Nersēs Shnorhali's theology and literature. He does not merely present the crucifixion as a historical or dogmatic fact, but interprets it as a theological and existential mystery. Christ's passion becomes the heart of God's revelation, the way of redemption, and the model of all Christian life. For Nersess, Christ's passion is the supreme expression of God's love for humanity. It is not just an act of atonement, but an act of love that penetrates the flesh and pain of this world. In many of his poetic prayers and liturgical hymns, he describes suffering Christ with an emotional and spiritual intensity. And I quote from Shnorhali, "You, the lamb immolated, who by your blood washed away the sin of the world, do not forsake me, the sinner, in the day of my trials." This view is similar to that of Eastern Fathers, but it is distinguished by a strong pastoral sensibility. The Passion is narrated not to be frightened, but to invite confidence in forgiveness. The cross is not just an instrument of death, but the way to life. This spirituality of the cross is reflected in the liturgical hymns sung during the Holy Week, in which the faithful are invited to follow the Lord of Golgotha, but always in the hope of the resurrection. As a mystical poet, Shnorhali uses a lyrical style to describe Christ's suffering. His work is rich in symbolic imagery, blood, tears, thorns, wounds, but all also light, mercy, and the Father's embrace. This poetic language inspires Armenian iconography, especially in the medieval miniatures in which the crucified Christ is depicted not as a judge, but as a bridegroom of the soul. His Passion theology also inspired miniatures in Armenian manuscripts that depict Christ's sufferings in a humanized and compassionate manner, in contrast to the more solemn Byzantine representations. The Last Judgment, as depicted here on this slide, is a frequent motif in Armenian miniatures, often showing Christ enthroned in glory, surrounded by angels, saints, and the scales of justice. Shnorhali's eschatology was rich with themes of divine mercy. His lamentation, boch, prayers, widely copied in manuscripts, encouraged hope and repentance, which translates visually into images of interceding saints and the Theotokos, Aspazatzin, pleading before Christ. In all these, Shnorhali's texts provide theological scaffolding for the artists, allowing image and word to co-create meaning. While he acknowledges the reality of divine judgment, he consistently underscores Christ's role as a merciful judge and an intercessor, echoing the Church's liturgical plea, "Judge me not with your wrath, but with your mercy." Armenian miniature paintings of the universal judgment reflects this theological orientation. Common features in these scenes include Christ enthroned in glory, surrounded by angels, apostles, and saints, with the Theotokos and John the Baptist often shown in intercession, emphasizing the hope of salvation. The saved are depicted moving towards the heavenly Jerusalem, while the damned are shown casting into the infernal abyss. Yet, even in these stark contrasts, the miniatures often highlight divine order, balance, and the ultimate triumph of justice and mercy. The visual symmetry, celestial hierarchy, and the presence of intercessors convey a theological message shaped by Shnorhali's thought. The Last Judgment is not only an end, but also a revelation of divine love, where every soul is weighed both with truth and compassion. And to conclude, the relationship between the theology of Saint Nersēs Shnorhali and the imagery in medieval Armenian miniatures is deeply reciprocal. The fusion of theology and art is thus not just a matter of aesthetics, but of deep spiritual integration. Miniatures are not merely decorations, but tools for the beholder, a guide through an experience of faith and contemplation. His theological emphasis of incarnation, divine harmony, symbolic vision, and poetic mysticism creates a fertile ground for the flourishing of a uniquely Armenian sacred art. The miniatures become a visual expression of theological truths, images that do not merely accompany the word, but become part of the way it is revealed, contemplated, and experienced. In this way, Shnorhali's legacy is not only a theological or literary, it is vividly and inseparably visual. Thank you, Rachel. Welcome back to our panel 5 on the other Nersess. Today we have Artemi Avesyan from the Matanadaran in Yerevan joining us. Dr. Avnisyan is a researcher at the Matenadaran in the Department of Translated Literature. She studied philology at Yerevan State University and graduated from the International MA in Armenian Studies course. Her research interests include the Armenian Studies, Digital Humanities, and Corpus Linguistics. She's the author of numerous publications on medieval Armenian literature and language. Welcome, Arpine. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we are very much eager and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank the conference organizers, Professor Roberta Ervin and Dr. Ani Shahinian, for this wonderful opportunity. My paper is about a panegyric, which is a unique biographical work dedicated to Nersēs Shnorhali. It was written by Archbishop Nersess Shnorhali, a prominent figure in 20th century Armenian medieval literature. This work holds historical value as it details Shnorhali's biographical, literary, and ecclesiastical preaching activities in considerable detail. Nersēs Shnorhali and Nersess Shnorhali, authors and church figures who hold unique roles and significant influence in the Armenian literature, connected not only through spiritual bonds, but also by strong family ties. Shnorhali's mother was Shahanduht, the daughter of Nersēs Shnorhali's brother Zoravar, better known as Shahan. At her initiative, her son Sambat, who had just turned 16, was ordained a priest by Catholicos Nersēs Shnorhali in 1168. He received the name Nersess, which guided him to follow the devout and patriotic path of the great Armenian Nersessians. Then, as Archbishop Malakia Ormanyan writes, Nersēs Shnorhali արդեն ուշիմ եւ մտածի երիտասարդ Շնորհալիի պես իմաստուն եւ գործունյա առաջնորդի մձեռքին տակ եւ հայրապետանոցի պաշտոնական շրջանակին մեջ եւ միութենական խնդիրներու հետ շփմամբ մեծամեծ իղձեր կազմեց այդ մասին եւ եռանդուն եւ բուռն զգացումներ ստացավ, որ իր կյանքին նկարագիրը կազմեցին. Nersēs Shnorhali, a bright and intelligent young man, was under the guidance of a wise and proactive leader like Shnorhali within the official circle of the Patriarchate and engaged with the issues of church union. He developed lofty aspirations and was inspired by passionate and fervent feelings that shaped his character and life. Therefore, it is no coincidence that Shnorhali undertook to write an encomium on his teacher and spiritual leader and entitled it accordingly Գովեստ ներբողական պատմագրական բանիվ հաղագս վարուց մեծի հայրապետին Տյառն Ներսիսի կլայեցվո հայոց կաթողիկոսի. A laudative praise with historical speech about the great patriarch, His Holiness Nersēs Shnorhali, Catholicos of the Armenians. Nersēs Aginian expresses the opinion that this encomium was probably written in August 1174 on the anniversary of the death of Nersēs Shnorhali, while he was in Hronkla. He notes that this is one of Shnorhali's earliest attempts at employing poetic meter. During our research in the Venice manuscript number 78, we discovered a small fragment added at the end of the panegyric, maintaining the same style as the entire text. This is not found in any other printed or handwritten copies we have examined. Նորոք բանի այսր կարգի տեր Ներսեսի երախայրի, երկնախմբից նախ պարակցի, երից անձանցն հուպ լինի, Ռաբունի անթոր Ջորջի, արմեց պատգամ աստարակի, սիրով հոգվույն հեզ երևի, ըստերունի սմբարբարի, Եկայք որդյակ կիմ սիրելի, որոց երկյուղն է պանծալի, սրբյալ սրտից, որի մարմնի աստվածությունն միշտ երևի. I tried to translate this and following parts by myself as the panegyric isn't translated. The new word in these lines is the first fruits of Father Nersess that interlaces to the groups in heaven and is close to Trinity. There he is called Rabbi and sends us a message here. Being meek with the love of the Spirit, he speaks the divine word. Come, my beloved children, who have glorious fear, to the purified hearts that are in the body, God always appears. Venice number 78 manuscript was written by Johannes in the 14th century. Here we observe the acrostic with the name Nersess. Although we have not yet examined all the manuscripts containing this work, we do not consider it probable that this passage is part of the main panegyric for several reasons. First, without that section, the poem already appears complete. And second, in Lambronazzi's works, we have not encountered any other use of the acrostic, which was a characteristic stylistic feature of Nersēs Shnorhali. Here there is an interesting phrase, first fruits of Father Nersess. If the scribe has added to or copied an exciting version, so by saying first fruits, he probably means that this panegyric is first fruits of Nersēs Lambronazzi, as the first literary work, although according to Revond Alishan, between 1171 to 1173, Lambronazzi had already written his panegyric dedicated to the Assumption of Virgin Mary. It remains to be seen whether the edition was already present in the original copy of this manuscript and whether the writer, whose name was Nersess, marked himself with an acrostic, a common practice in the Middle Ages, or whether the edition belongs to the priest Johannes, who, employing the acrostic style typical of Shnorhali, dedicated it to Shnorhali. It's hard to say yet. In some printed sources, the 12th line rhymed intercessory prayer Govasanutun Serpuin Nersesi is often included, although it is not part of the original text. In manuscripts, it is generally not positioned after the panegyric, and in some instances, it appears as a separate work. The authorship of this prayer remains a subject of ongoing study. Govest Nerbogakan is the most extensive of Nersēs Lambronazzi's verse works, containing very important historical information. The author composed a biographical panegyric in the style of Nersēs Shnorhali's Vipassanutun, the first of its kind in Armenian literature. With this, he seems to have continued the story of the Pehlavuni family, presenting the life of Nersēs Shnorhali during historical events. Shnorhali composed the Vipassanutun around 1121. It stands as the first historical work written in a poetic style, serving as a poetic miniature of Armenian history. The work traces the lineage of the Pehlavuni family from Saint Gregory the Illuminator to Gregory II Vagayased. Shnorhali uses syllable assonance or rhyme. This was perhaps an Arabic influence, which we also see in Grigor Magistros's Hazardoghian, where the whole poem is written with the rhyme in. The main part of Vipassanutun is written in the rhyme eal, except for the prologue, which lines has the ending e. In terms of genre, Vipassanutun has no predecessor, although there are parallels with Hazardoghian. In terms of rhyme and rhythm, they are completely different in content. Magistros's poem is largely a brief description of the Bible, unlike Shnorhali, who had Movses Khorenatzi's History of Armenia as his main source when writing Vipassanutun. Unlike Magistros and Shnorhali, Lambronazzi's work is not monorhymed. The rhymes often change. We can encounter lines with ni, tsi, a, kan, eal, and other endings. The lines mostly consist of 8 syllables. Dr. Heriknaz Vorskanyan, who has examined Shnorhali's poems in detail, notes that Shnorhali's motive for writing the historical poem was to express gratitude to his ancestors and to tell about them, highlighting both their good and bad deeds. However, Lambronazzi's intention was not only to express his love and gratitude, but also to present this panegyric as a consolation to many mourners a year after the death of their beloved Catholicos. Տեղեկանալ զայս հարակար, անհակ անվան նսեր դենջա, տարաշխարի կոտնմուրա, թաղցյալ իսուք նստյալ ողբա, մխտարի կարետանա. For many souls desire always to know this. An insatiable love yearns for his name, his pilgrim flock. Weeping, they sit in mourning and laments. longing to be consoled. The author emphasizes the particularly humble and modest character of Nersēs Shnorhali by bringing various examples. Բայց հեզ հոգին չբարձրամտի, զանձն ի հետին կարգի ունի, ըսխոնարհության տեղն ընդունի, պատվիլ երբեք ոչ հոժարի. But the meek soul doesn't arrogant, places himself in the last rank, takes a humble place, never agrees to be honored. Elsewhere, Shnorhali writes that after receiving the offer to become Catholicos, Shnorhali initially refuses, saying, Ես անպիտան ծառայասեր չեմ հովության կարգածը տեր, վերջին տեղույն ըղձամիսեր, թերևս անզբաղ կյանքս իմ լիներ. I am an unprofitable servant, he said. I am not a master of that order of shepherding. I long for the last place with love, so that perhaps my life may be unoccupied. As a result of constant fasting and fragility, he had acquired a number of illnesses, about which the author emphasizes his reserved and tolerant character. Nersēs անհաս զանձն ճնշող, նիաս կենո քնչարչարող, իհանապազ պահս աշխատող, մարմնույն ներհակ միշտ կամեցող. Nersēs was a secret oppressor of himself, suffering himself by a lowly life, troubling himself in constant fasting, always willing the opposite of the body. Though Shnorhali was moderate, gentle, and humble in his personal life, we see the complete opposite image in his social, church, and welfare works. Various fascinating details about Shnorhali can be found in this panegyric. It is from here that we learn that from a very early age he had a love for writing and literature, and was endowed with the diligence of a bee, willingly accepting the efforts of his brother Gregory to educate him. Իմյանձանց սրբոց կոչե, դաստիարակ ուսման կարգե, Nersēs զանուն նախնվույն կոչե և իմաստյուկ զնավարժե. Սիրով մանուկ ընձայս ողջունե, հինքն զմեղվի արհեստ բերե, շրջի իբանես և ժողովե, հաննյուտ ծաղկանց բեռն կազմե. He calls him from the holy hermits. He makes for him an educator in study. He names him after his ancestor Nersess and trains him with wisdom. The child accepts that with love. He contains within him the craft of the bee. He flies among words and gathers and makes provision from immaterial flowers. We also learned that Shnorhali not only wrote charagans, but also arranged them, personally sang them, and taught to others. He also had a very beautiful handwriting, which his biographer mentions, որպես հորանս ուլուց ցուցավ, գեղեցկադիր գիրն կարգավ. In addition to presenting the life and work of his teacher, Lambronatsi also speaks about Grigor Vagayaser, who had a direct connection to Shnorhali, as well as his brother Grigor, who is also called the Little Vagayaser and Grigor Taga. Now let's see whether this work, apart from being a historical biographical work, presents any literary value or not. In the panegyric, Lambronatsi himself confesses that although he has a great desire to praise his spiritual father with worthy words, he is untrained and his knowledge of versification is incomplete. Scholars such as Garegin Zarpanalian and others expressed the opinion that this work has no literary value. Manuk Aberian considers this work as a lyrical piece in which there are expressed the author's feelings towards Shnorhali and is marked the beginning of a new literary genre, the versed biography. However, he also notes that this work has no artistic value. Grigor Hakopian, who has thoroughly studied Lambronatsi's literary heritage, emphasizes that this work should be evaluated not by the standards of our time. It is truly a beautiful poem filled with numerous examples of comparison and metaphor. To make Grigor Hakopian's statement more convincing, let's bring some examples of neologisms, words or word forms in Govesner Boragan, which testify not only to the author's ornate style, but also to his original word creation, since most of them created precisely to preserve the rhyme at the end of the words. It should be noted that the study was conducted based on data provided by existing dictionaries and databases, which may be subject to change as new data emerges. We didn't find some of those words in dictionaries at all, and for the other part, only Lambronatsi was mentioned as the source. These are Anirhakan, that doesn't sleep, Khartnakan, obscure, Kırknamatyal, double-folded, Sarnamatyal, frozen as ice, Metzarich, someone who honors, Sigaç to walk with proud, and Tağergutun, hymnody. And summarizing the above-mentioned issues, I want once again note that Nersēs Lambronatsi's panegyric, dedicated to his teacher and spiritual leader Nersēs Shnorhali, is first and foremost an important historical source for us. It also has literary stylistic features, which allow us to say that being one of the author's first works, it has also artistic significance. Thank you very much.
I didn't ask for this, but I was asked to introduce Dr. Armenian Shnorhali. She is a senior researcher at the Madenataran Mesopartos Institute of Ancient Manuscripts, affiliated with the Department of Art and Scribal Centers and Armenian Medieval Philology and Literature. Since 2024, they have led the study group of Armenian medieval music. Her research focuses on medieval Armenian numerated manuscripts, including the Manrusuna, Dansaran, and Gatsurtaran. Working with manuscripts from collections in Yerevan, Vienna, Venice, Aleppo, and Jerusalem, they analyze Armenian numeric notation and its relationship to oral liturgical tradition. Tamrazian is currently preparing a critical edition of the Gatsurtaran anthems, Gatsurts, from the Cilician period 12th to 15th centuries, employing their liturgical function and textual variation. In parallel, her research explores the symbolism of music in the Armenian spiritual and theological paracanonical literature, tracing how music imagery evolved in Armenian theological anthropology and the notion of prayer. Arvisyag, this is your time. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to be introduced by Professor Abraham Derian. And first of all, of course, I would like to express my deep gratitude for the organizers of this conference, to Professor Dr. Roberta Erwin and Dr. Ani Shainyan, for the organization of this beautiful multi-layered conference and for the invitation. I hope that I will be able to make my small contribution to this. So I'll try to share. So I decided to start my report. Do you see my?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So I decided to start my report with these images, which in my opinion best express the essence that lies at the heart of the Armenian medieval monastic life and the context of this conference as the basis of Nersēs the Gracious and his spiritual environment, as the symbol of internal relationships and uninterrupted spiritual continuity, heredity. The basis of Armenian cultural movements often has been, as is well known, the intellectual noble families and the entire program that these families have drawn up for the creation of a common Christian Armenian spiritual intellectual space. In all these images, birds are intertwined with each other in one body and two heads, or with intertwined throats, that is, with a united existence in the word of Logos, and expressing the vital new word of God in plant symbolism, or with a united chest and throat, that is, with a united heart, devotion, and word in Christ the Logos. Birds as flying spiritual beings always appear in the Armenian tradition in the more crucial points of Christian sacraments. In this image, I have given the biblical passages next to which these birds are located in the margins of Gospel manuscripts. So these are the disciples of John the Baptist who are looking for and finding Christ, and most importantly, the two disciples who are walking to Emmaus and Christ appears to them. The image in the middle can also be the symbol of incarnate Christ with the three wings, which is the principle of the Trinity, and with one directed downwards as the symbol of Christ's descent, with two heads, with humanity and divinity. Anyway, in all cases, they are depicted in scenes of spiritual unity. This image was conveyed most expressively by Gregory of Narek, which also painted as if spiritual biography of his book of Lamentations, which was written on the basis of the spiritual unity of the two brothers, their spiritual life in one breath, Hamash and Chabes, in constant prayer. These old pictures remind me of this colophon by Gregory. And this image could symbolize, as it seems to me, the spiritual connections of Nersess the Gracious and his brother Grigor Pahlavuni, the connection of Nersess the Gracious and Lambronati, the connection of Lambronati and Gregory of Narek. The last one, one of the monuments of this union is Book of Lamentations, copied by Lambronati and under his leadership, where Narikati and his book are presented as a single whole. Not copied, but ordered, sorry, with 4 stages of transformation. Then Nersess the Gracious, being the brother and successor of Ketlikos Grigoris Pahlavuni, and later Ketlikos himself, had the opportunity to incorporate all his liturgical hymns and implement his ideas concerning liturgical renewal and reform. That fact, as it seems to me, influenced the scale of his activities with their unprecedented scope. So before going on the main subject of my report, which is the appropriation of the Psalms in both interpretive tradition and liturgical elaboration, connected with the creative activities of Nersess of Lambron and Nersess the Gracious, I would like to show the examples of above-mentioned united spiritual life in one breath in examples of spiritual chanting. Grigor Pahlavuni himself was the author of odes. In addition to his brother's ode written at a very early age, the Catholicos also dedicated one of his compositions to Gregory the Illuminator. It should be noted that mostly odes are composed of ode tune or tunes multi-part compositions according to the neumes, which unfortunately often wasn't reflected in Armenian editions. Sometimes ode tune parts are not divided correctly. Anyway, Armenia Kyoshkerian has noted that in both older and later manuscripts, Pahlavuni's above-mentioned ode often appears as a tune for Nersēs Shnorhali's first ode, dedicated to the same canon. The researcher considers this to be a result of later editing. However, it seems probable to me that already during Shnorhali's time, his and his brother's poems dedicated to the Illuminator could be united into one multi-part composition. The presence of this ode in manuscript tradition is a beautiful testimony to the unity of two brothers, their collaboration around the vision of spiritual Armenia and its creature. Regardless of this, Nersess the Gracious also uses the melody of his brother in other odes with the same metrical structure, as you can see in these examples. This melody, of course, was used also by further authors. Of course, we also can consider that Nersēs the Gracious created melodies for his own odes and endowed the ode of his brother with the same melody, but in our context, it doesn't even matter. In all cases, this is an expression of the unity of their creativity in spiritual life. Which is highly symbolical for me is that this melody, dedicated to Gregory the Illuminator, the creature of Armenian spiritual life, was used for the ode of the Nativity. These two visions are intertwined also in Nersēs the Gracious ode. He also further uses the melody of his own ode dedicated to Gregory the Illuminator in another ode dedicated to Nativity. Of course, the use of pattern melodies is the main feature of medieval spiritual chanting, but for the essential part, at least in the art of Nersēs the Gracious, we can also find commonalities in symbolic strata. Beyond this, of course, all Christian mysteries are connected through one main mystery of the Incarnation, Resurrection, and this connection is reflected in various texts dedicated to different martyrs, saints, and mysteries endowed with the same visions and symbolic structures. So, I tried to make more or less complete list of the model melodies and the basis of their commonality, which lies primarily in the metric structure, but also in the symbolic allusions to each other. Here I just select some notes from the vast network of Taran formula melodies, just to show the continuous heredity associated with the persons of my report. Stepanos Shnorhali's ode dedicated to the cross has had a huge influence on the Armenian liturgical music, judging by the manuscript tradition and numation throughout the centuries. Here I give just some examples which borrow its melody endowed with ornamented melismatic outpourings, as you can see in hymn structures. Even Gregory of Narek uses this melody several times. It was used by Nersēs the Gracious, and then by Nersess of Lambron. Gregory of Narek connects the narrative of martyrs imitating the sufferings of Christ with the image of cross through this common melody. Lambronati connects the same melody with scenes of Christ's death and resurrection. Again, of course, Gregory of Narek could have used the melody of Stepanos Shnorhali, while both of them could have undergone some editing in the Cilician period, particularly by Nersēs the Gracious, who also uses this melody many times. But again, this does not matter in our context of the community of spiritual vision, spiritual life, and spiritual breadth, performance, and continuous transmission. In the third example I have selected, again, we can find both Nersēs imprints. The multi-part old tunes composition of Hovannes Sarkavat is dedicated to resurrection or oil-bringing women gospels. It was sung after it. This second part, judging by the neumes, is the central point of the composition, the most colored by melismatic ornaments. It depicts the humiliation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ. The melody of this part was used by St. Nersēs in his ode dedicated to Good Friday, the day of crucifixion. In the ode dedicated to Stepanos Protomartyr, the latter is compared to a grapevine planted on the cross of Christ, which you can also see reflected in the marginal illumination. Thus, in these examples, I have tried to show this only some notes from this common vision in ever-present liturgical space and time. Now we are moving to the main subject, to the psalmody. Nersēs Shnorhali at his very young age wrote the most extensive work of Armenian literature, the commentary on the Psalms, endowed with simple language, but full of complex symbolical images, saturated with tropological, allegorical strata of interpretations, especially that of connected with theological anthropology. It should be noted that mostly all of the interpretations are highly allegorical. He tries as if rebuild new edifice spiritual from the former material of some text. In Armenian tradition, in tune with the entire Christian culture, not only the daily offering, but also the personal, I'm sorry, it was written for the brothers in the church for their daily instruction and appropriation, who sang these psalms every day in various forms of liturgical chanting. This is reflected in colophon. You see this in screenshot. In Armenian tradition, in tune with the entire Christian culture, not only the daily offering, but also the personal, perpetual inner-speaking prayer is based on the psalmody, as is well known. In this context, the definitions by Athanasius of Alexandria for the Psalms are crucial. He considered the Psalter not only as a treasure containing all the books of the Old Testament and prophesies of incarnation, crucifixion, ascension, but all the aspects of the human soul's movements, feelings, and situations, whereby the Psalter has all the keys to all possible kinds of human natures and dialogues with God. This notion floats in introductions to the Psalms spread in medieval Armenian tradition. This universal function of the Psalter in spiritual exercising becomes all the more interesting in the light of an interpretive or symbolic etymology of the word psalm by Gregory of Tatev, which is possible only in Armenian. So it is, psalm sounds like psalmos, and psalm, the meaning of the psalm is embryo. The psalm was considered to be an embryo in the womb of mind, creating within this spiritual realm. This interpretation pertains to the last unnumbered psalm with reference to David's creating his instrument. Respectively, the psalmody, and all its forms, singing, dancing, instrumental accompaniment, were considered integral to the main Christian concept of rational and only rational sacrifice as the core of Christian liturgy. Professor Terian also emphasized the special role, the special appropriation of human voice in this sacrifice as the most supreme form in material creation, which seems to fuse all these instruments into itself. All these external attributes of psalmody must be transformed, converted in interpretive tradition into the inward tools of the human soul, its abilities, senses, voice, and articulate speech to draw him close to God. They become mystical indicators that express the existential integrity, the awakening of all his abilities to glorify incarnated Logos in full ontological scales. Of course, all these interpretations are common in the Christian heritage as a whole. What is especially emphasized in the Armenian commentaries is the unity of human's twofold world, soul and body, into one, through voice and word. Also, unification of all the creation through this unity offered to one God. The spiritual psalmody engaged the material strata of creation through the same material breathing layers in human structure, united with and thus transformed through his articulate speech. It presents thus the union of the noetic, endowed with articulate speech, living, endowed with voice, and material, endowed with sound, words. Through this, it also reflects the fullness of the rational sacrifice in living voice and spiritual word. In mystic literature are elaborated deeply the images of rational offering as a living entity, and on the other hand, as likeness, the Word, and the Trinity. This is a very important point. Human is not only a microcosm, a bearer of the spheres of macrocosm in his structures, but he is the image of God, which was discussed especially by Gregory of Nyssa. Accordingly, his sacrifice, the worship of word and voice, was considered not only the bearer of the human structure in its fullness, but also the bearer of the image of God. There are references in Armenian interpretations to the Christian idea of categorizing mind, nous, thought, logos and diathetos, and others word, logos prophorikos, as divine qualities based on the principle of the Trinity in man. Nersēs defines the principle of the Trinity as the thought, Father, Word, Logos, Son, and other Word, Spirit. Gregory of Tatev identifies the voice of God in the Psalm 17 with spirit's ability of widespreading. In harmony with this, he places this identification within the human rational structure in liturgical context, with some transformation of above presented divisions by Nersēs involving also human voice. As the integrity of three aspects, that of thought, its verbalization, the voice, singing, in psalmody. The union of voice speech bears thus the mystery of spirit and son. Thus, since the human nature, perceived as a center of creation and called junction chain in medieval Armenian interpretations, holds the mixture of worlds as the image of God and as microcosm, it is befitting for this body to be transformed into instrument for this harmony, a reciprocal gift, bringing to one focus these two words and offer to God. In this key, it is highly remarkable that in the early Armenian translation of the Psalms, the musical instruments mentioned in the Psalms were already replaced with common expressions of singing or worship, unlike the same instruments in other books of scripture, such as Kings, Chronicles, etc. Only the trumpet, horn, and of course the psalter are retained due to their special symbolism. There are some articles by Levon Petrosyan about this subject. The other instruments mentioned in the Psalms have been translated, as Father Chamchan says, into words expressing the instruments of the heart, such as joy, rejoicing, blessing, word, utterance. For example, the word joy is used as substitute for harp, drum, trumpet, dance. The reason for this translation in Old Armenian, as I said, is the aforementioned function of the Psalms as the core of liturgy and rational sacrifice. Accordingly, Armenian exegesis as double interpretation of the former interpretive translation led to much more double abstractions compared, for example, to the Greek tradition. The most expressive example would be the commentary on the last 150th Psalm by Nersēs of Lambrun, possibly only due to the Old Armenian translation. Here again, the early Armenian translation already gives substitutions for musical instruments mentioned in the Psalms. You see this. According to Chamchan, in this interpretive translation, expressions are harmonized with features of instruments. Trumpet is translated as blessing because it is proper for this instrument to bless God with loud sound. The drum and similar instruments which were ordered to bless with exaltation are replaced by the word exaltation. Two other instruments which are ordered to bless with joy are translated as rejoicing. Cymbals with their sweet sounds and jubilate cymbals with their loud utterance, mezzabarbar, are translated respectively as sweet words and audible speech. But what is very characteristic is that the Armenian translation allows Nersēs of Lambrun in his commentary on the Psalms to construct the climax of the spiritual path at the end of the Psalter in the last Psalm, harmonizing it with the words of Paul as gradual steps of human approach to God. Nersēs of Lambrun understands the Psalter as a holistic composition in tune with, of course, Christian and exegetical tradition, the path through the penitential prayers of the first Psalms to love. In this key, he emphasizes everywhere in his enormous work the place of each psalm, why it follows the previous one and why the next one follows it. And at the final point, he builds the pinnacle of this path, relying on mystical images pointing to the final union with the bridegroom in images of the Song of Songs. Here you see the excerpts from this interpretation. Love is source of glory which emanates it. He refers to the epistle to the Galatians. Consequently, for those who have oriented themselves toward God, who enthusiastically desire his love, this offers encouragement, blessing from that love. Here Lambronazzi also alludes to the musical instruments that exist in the original text, in terms of Christian understanding of them as an animated instrument of human, his voice, and therefore as an expression of love for God in the fullness of human sense perceptible and spiritual worship. In conjunction with this, or with the word rejoicing, as the next step, Lambronazzi says, at first there needs to be awe whereby the passions are eradicated, after which the one cleans through awe begets love. This in turn bears exaltation and rejoicing in God, etc. Then he describes unity with God. These two, rejoicing and exaltation, are, according to him, apex of all virtues. We have been previously edified by other songs to other parts of virtue, and now he invites us to the utmost level of fullness or completion. Then, as the next level, Nersēs of Lambron also comments on the word sweet, speaking to God with a sweet word as the fruit of joy, according to the words of Paul. And through the last verse of the psalm, let everything that has breath praise the Lord, after the image of attachment of all creatures to this glory, in terms of the renewal and the new way of relatedness, union with creation through Christ's incarnation, Lambronazzi unites the lyre of his soul to this great edifice of God's glorification, as you said in colophon. In such a way, he harmonizes the verses of the psalm with the words of Paul as steps of spiritual life which give birth to each other. Now we will move on to the appropriation of the Psalms themselves, to some examples of the elaboration of their content in liturgical forms by Nersēs the Gracious. All the collections named Manrusum, Minute Learning, containing melismatic songs of the breviary, open with the song Hishesuk by St. Nersēs, and some of the manuscripts open with Shnorhali's miniature, which presents the leading role assigned to him in the establishment of melismatic performance of breviary song. Most part of Manrusum content consists of breviary songs composed of 2 psalm verses. As is well known, besides the simple continuous psalmody, the various ways of singing of the psalms become the heart of the liturgical exercise over the entire Christian practice, such as joining of exact psalm verses for this or that feast, their framing by melismatic refrains, alleluias, glorious combination of 2 various psalm verses, and their framing by non-scriptural compositions woven from the same selected psalms, commonplaces in so-called kings, takavor, etc. All these forms of the resounding psalterium are endowed with highly melismatized structures, at least in the Armenian Cilician period. I emphasize this feature of codices, since from breviary songs of St. Nersēs, only this song was included in these manuscripts. The song Hishesuk, performed during night vigils, is endowed with melismatic structures, and it is entirely woven from psalm verses. In this light, it is very characteristic that Gregory of Tatev interprets this song in his commentary on the Psalms. This is the only song that he interprets in his work. Below on the right is the text of the first part of the song. On the left are the corresponding psalm verses that he uses. As we can see, Shnorhali adds almost no words, while at the same time adapting the various psalms to each other, harmonizing them with the mystery of spiritual awakening in all lines except the last. If there is none in the psalm, he adds forms of address to the Lord and transforms the verb into the plural, exhorting in the first person, giving the composition a more richer, prayerful future. Sometimes he intertwined 2 psalm verses into one line, as in the second line stanza of song. In the fourth line or stanza, he created a textual intertext. He used two lines of Psalm 115, while the expression in course of the house of the Lord is also present in Psalm 133 in Armenian translation. The next line of which refers to another stanza of the song. In the medieval monastic tradition, where the psalms were not only fully assimilated through various ritual daily performances, interpretations, but were also performed musically in various genres, these combinations, unification in a new composition certainly had to give rise to a unique experience of polyphonic meanings. It should be noted that Freishoff, who attempts to examine the Armenian breviary in his voluminous work, the Armenian breviary in the context of other ancient rites that branched off from the ancient Jerusalem liturgy or presumably preserved in its tradition, notice that the Armenian Night Office lacks Psalm 133, which is present in the so-called Syrian and Palestinian traditions. Accordingly, he pays special attention to this verse of the psalm, suggesting that it could have been presented at one time in Armenian Night Office, to which the following litany also alludes. The song by Nersēs, the Gracious, could have been added to this psalm. It seems possible to me that wishing to complete the service, Shnorhali could have inserted into the song a hint of the missing psalm. On the other hand, this song is woven from various psalms, and in the ritual tradition, it is much more closely connected with another psalm, which lies in the central part of this song, Awake My Glory. And it is precisely by reaching this psalm that Datevati interprets the entire song composed by Shnorhali. In this section, Shnorhali turns a single line of psalm into a symphony of a tenfold repeated call to vigilance, watchfulness, addressed to the children of Zion, to the sons of light saved by blood, the new people, the brides enlightened like virgins. Parallel to awakening images of light, blazing flames and torches are evoked. The last three stanzas are incrustations for true awakening, to shed tears as oil to keep the lamps burning, to worship and pray. In the next part, Shnorhali addresses the same call to awakening in the opposite direction to God, this time again connecting with Psalm 43 through this image of awakening reflected in the joints of man, God, at the hour of the night acquired a special profundity and effect. The first part of the commentary by Gregory of Tatev, this song presents, as we see, this material life, movements in it, cosmic and human. The second part presents as if intermediate waiting a year from this world to the next. The third part presents awakening and entering the world of eternity. These following three stanzas addressed to God are connected with the resurrection of Christ and the widowhood of humanity from the bridegroom Christ in anticipation of his coming, since the previous part expresses the image of the virgin's virgins awaiting the bridegroom. Thus, indirectly, Gregory of Tatev connects the appeal addressed to God with the resurrection of Christ, called for his awakening for human. Finally, the fourth part of interpretation, after the connecting node of Christ's awakening, presents the awakening here simultaneously after the resurrection in the future life of the totality of human structures in these two, with its 5 awakened feelings, 5 stanzas of the song to God. And he concludes with the symbolism of 24 stanzas of all this composition, both as fullness of the time in material world and eternal singing. And in all these spheres, there is a main vision, the main spiritual feeling of watchfulness in its various transformations in these worlds, spaces, and times. In another song, Shnorhali uses a completely different principle of elaboration of the Psalms. The song was performed during Divine Liturgy, which unfortunately does not preserved in current liturgy among many other samples. On the left side, you see the Song of Communion, which is preserved in current tradition. Again, it is completely woven from psalm lines that have 33, 30, or 34 connected with communion and with approach towards light, and one of the last psalms reflecting heavenly everlasting glorification. But in Cilician period, there was another prolonged version of this song, you see on the right side, with stanzas encrusted between the psalm verses, divided between the days of the week. Later, the author sang instead of this composition. The first stanza, referring to the Psalm 33, accordingly interviews images of light on the one hand and the temple of God on the other. The second stanza, according to the psalm, connects images of eating. In the following stanzas, images of heavenly singing on the one hand, and the gradual path and fulfillment of the sacrifice on earth on the other hand, are successively drawn. In the last episode dedicated to the Shabbat, when Christ was buried, having conquered death, the dead are remembered, and Christ is presented as Lamb according to the eschatological vision of the book of Revelation. These incrustations are crowned with penitential exclamations of Have Vormia, while the psalm lines, on the contrary, are crowned with exclamations of Hallelujah. And this universal path of sacrifice, reflected in the heavenly and earthly mirrors, is embellished in its gradual progress by the melismatic outpourings of Alleluia, which increasingly intense. Also in the neumes, but you can see at first there is one Alleluia, then two, and then three. As final addition to this, I just would love to present the reflection of this multi-part composition, this mystery in miniature. The scribe miniatures, Grigor Sukyasans, provides an expressive solution to this composition, depicting birds in different positions in the margins of this song. The first two small birds will depict the church children partaking in Christ's table and his sweetness. The third and the fourth depict the partaking of divine doctrine and sacrifice. Although water is in the cup in the picture, baptism is also connected with the sacrament of communion, as Professor Abraham Dejan also mentioned. Since the third episode mentions the apostles who were fishermen, the tasting pod doctrine is depicted, as it seems to me, as eating fish. The last pair could, I think, allegorically represents the heavenly glorification of God on the spiritual rock, and the descending position of the last word is the descent of Christ with burial and liberation of the dead. Thank you very much for your attention and for your patience.
It's been my very pleasant duty during this conference to introduce only people who need no introduction. Bishop Daniel is certainly in that class of people. I don't need to tell you that Michael Daniel Fadikian is a bishop of the Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Church, research professor in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at Catholic University of America, director of doctoral studies at Kevorkian Seminary of Holy See of Etchmiadzin, and professor of liturgical studies at St. Nersēs Armenian Seminary, where he served as dean from 2000 to 2012. Bishop Daniel earned his doctoral degree at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome under the direction of the late, great Robert F. Taft, S.J. He's published dozens of scholarly articles, several books, many popular essays on the history, theology, and interpretation of the liturgies of the Armenian and other Eastern churches. His latest work, the Book of Hours of the Armenian Church, Introduction and Complete English Translation, long awaited, will be published this year by the Catholic University of America Press. Bishop Daniel.
Thank you, Dr. Erdogan. very much for kind words. And thank you, Dr. Ani and Dean and all the panelists and speakers and participants of this really wonderful gathering. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to be here yesterday, as I am listening to the talks today that refer constantly back to yesterday's presentations. I feel even worse that I missed that, and I'll miss tomorrow morning. My apologies, especially to Professor Cowie, who will give the concluding address. What I'm presenting today is, let's call it a kind of an update on research that has been ongoing for many, many years now. Started long ago, and it started with a simple liturgical question in my mind that arose, I think, before I was even a seminarian, and never found an adequate response, and ended up having to look into it myself and discovering a lot of things that I didn't expect. And hopefully this will all come together at some point in a book, maybe within the next couple of years, with your prayers. I've published a number of papers on this topic. This presents one aspect of that work which I call today Nersēs Shnorhali versus monastic heterodoxy. My voice is a little funny. I don't know why. Two simultaneous dynamics distinguish monastic life in Armenia in the early centuries of the second millennium. The flourishing of monasticism in general, as witnessed, among other markers, by a surge in the construction of monastic buildings, and a growing ideological divide between Armenia's northern and eastern monasteries on the one hand, and the ecclesiastical center in Cilicia. Underlying and perhaps even fueling these two dynamics is an unmistakable penitential spirituality that is discernible in the Armenian Church in the 10th at this time, which is traceable to the northern and eastern monasteries of Greater Armenia, beginning in the 10th and continuing at least through the 14th centuries. One thinks instinctively of St. Gregory of Notting's Book of Prayers, with its highly refined and trenchant theology of repentance, which itself opened the millennium and indelibly shaped Armenian spirituality thereafter to this day, and literally this day, as we've heard today. The repository and vehicle for the perpetuation of that deeply penitential vision was the Church's liturgical tradition, which during this period became imbued with a stark sense of mankind's sinfulness and futility when mankind finds himself alienated from God. More perhaps than any neighboring Christian tradition, the Armenians developed a treasury of specifically penitential hymns of various classes, most notably the 5 anonymous cantata-like penitential compositions known as Takavor Havidyan, Eternal King, that conclude the night hour office, and the over 100 so-called Vohormia Sharagans, Have Mercy, based on Psalm 50:51. That psalm, the penitential prayer par excellence, was already a fixed component of the morning hour office, Aravodyanjam, at the turn of the 8th century, when the erudite Bishop Stepanos of Sunik penned his commentary on the Armenian liturgy of the hours. Before that, it was a component of the Palestinian Horologion, which seems to have influenced the Armenian Jamakirk very early on, Jamakirk Book of Hours. Today, Psalm 50:51 finds its place in virtually every Armenian church service, a diffusion unknown in any other liturgical tradition. Later, during the period under consideration today, chains of these penitential sharagans, hymns, also came to be chanted during the monastic night vigil of Wednesdays, Fridays, and during Lenten and fasting seasons. Noteworthy as well are many of the hymns of St. Nersess the Gracious, including the somber 36-strophe Ashar Amenaim, All the World, sung during the non-festal night office. All of these hymns bemoan the inherent sinful tendencies of men and women. They plead for divine mercy as humanity's only hope for redemption, while they celebrate God's philanthropy in Jesus Christ. The Armenian Church's understanding of penance is further reflected in her traditionally severe fasting practices. It is no doubt significant that in the Armenian Lenten season, that came to be designated, in Armenian, the Lenten season came to be designated as simply ahuhats, salt and bread, the main food of the Lenten season, in the strictest sense. The 13th century historian Giragos Gansagetsi noted that it was the custom in the eastern regions of Armenia, so the place and time of today's remarks, to shift various liturgical feasts to the nearest Sunday, not for convenience, as we sometimes do today, not to lessen the burden of the protracted church services, but so as not to disrupt the regular Wednesday and Friday fasts. And that's a perspective, to my knowledge, unknown in other churches. So guarding the penitential spirit of Wednesdays and Fridays, even more so than guarding the resurrection victorious sort of perspective and spirit of Sundays. The same rigorous outlook, likely championed by the Latin Crusaders, fueled the development early in the millennium of ever more stringent policies regarding private confession and penance. In a famous letter to the 11th century Catholicos Grigor Vagayaser, the martyrophile, the Syrian patriarch Yohanan Bar Shushan rails against what he considers to be the Armenians' excessively severe penitential practice. And since I have a little bit of time, and this is such a classic allegation against the Armenians and entertaining, I will read it. So this is the Syriac patriarch writing to the Armenian Catholicos. Concerning the manner of confession, the Armenians do not conduct themselves according to appropriate principles. Instead, they list every kind of sin that could ever be committed in the world, as well as those that will never be committed. And when one wishes to confess his sins and to receive forgiveness, the priest is seated, and the penitent reads to him in order, one by one, all that he has done, as well as what he has not done, and things like this that he has never even heard of or imagined. Having just translated into English the let's call it an examination of conscience that's found in the beginning of the Jamakirk, I can attest that that is indeed the case. I was forced, although I tend to be a perfectionist in these areas, to extract one line of that confessional statement because it's too horrible to even contemplate. And I made a note of that as a good writer should do. So I simply, this will be more distracting than it's worth. So I can only imagine what that is. So getting to the point, it is, however, another much more unusual manifestation of medieval Armenian monasticism's austere ethos that will occupy the remainder of this paper. Beginning in the 12th century and continuing through at least the turn of the 15th century, we find scattered references in Armenian literary sources to the very strange custom in some northern and eastern monasteries of banishing all of the faithful from the church, shutting the main doors and reserving entry exclusively to the liturgical celebrant of the day. All of the people, even the non-presiding clergy and monks, not just catechumens and unrepentant sinners, were effectively excommunicated. They attended all of the liturgical services, including the Eucharist, from behind the closed main doors of the church. This strange usage seems to be at the root of several highly unusual practices that have become customary in the Armenian church, specifically during Great Lent, which present a range of problems for the Armenian church today. The closing of the sanctuary curtain for the duration of Great Lent, and even more peculiar, the suppression of Holy Communion for all the faithful during the entire Lenten period. The practice of celebrating the Eucharist without distributing Holy Communion is otherwise unknown in Christendom. Seemingly related as well are a number of contradictions and problems connected to the solemnity known as the Great Carnival, Hunparigentan, the day before Great Lent starts. Depending upon how one interprets the conflicting information in the liturgical books, this day is either a day of feasting and celebration that leads up to Great Lent, an opportunity to clear out the cupboards of all of the foods that will be prohibited during the Great Fast, or it is already the sober first day of Lent. Ambiguities in the function and rubrics of the ceremony of the opening of the door, Turin Patsek, conducted in the evening of Palm Sunday, that is on the threshold between Lent and Holy Week, also likely derived from this area. Our knowledge of the medieval monastic practice of sealing off the churches to the faithful can be pieced together from scattered allusions in a number of ecclesiastical writings from the period beginning with the famous correspondence between Catholicos Nersēs Shnorhali and Theodorianus, the emissary of Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus, shortly before the Catholicos' death in 1173. And I understand that that was the topic of Professor Papazian's talk yesterday, which I missed. And then those references end rather suddenly with associated remarks in the writings of St. Gregory of Datev, just inside the 15th century. Our most explicit and detailed surviving testimony to the usage, however, comes from the pen of the young bishop of Tarsus in the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, Nersess of Lambron, in a letter of his edited more than 150 years ago, but almost completely overlooked by modern scholars. Nersess vehemently condemns the practice of barring the faithful from the church, in addition to other usages that he considered reprehensible, but which were observed in certain monasteries in northeastern Armenia, in particular the monasteries of Hakhpat and Sanahin, both of whose fractious abbots Nersess mentioned by name. In what remains, I would like to look more closely at this letter's testimony concerning Lampronazzi's condemnation of the practice of prohibiting the faithful from entering the church. In so doing, we will hopefully better understand the origin and form of the strange practice, discern how those monasteries justified the practice, and finally, discover how Nersess repudiated what the young bishop condemned as irremediable heterodoxy. The letter in question is actually a long treatise. It bears the title, quote, "In response to the inquiry of brother presbyters, an examination of the rights of the church and explanatory definition of innovations that have entered from outside," end of the quote. The letter was published in 1847, together with Nersess's famous commentary on the Divine Liturgy, in whose shadow it has been obscured and entirely passed over by scholars. As far as I can tell, neither Saatetian or Manyan, Hagopian, Ashtian, nor any of the authoritative surveys of medieval Armenian literature, including Zarpanalian and Aperian, mention, much less analyze, the letter. Only Revon Alishan refers to it incidentally in his inventory of Nersess's writings, dismissing it as, quote, "a letter against the quackery of the monks of Hakhpat, which it was fitting for Nersess to write as a sort of Ciceronian self-defense." Nersess, don't need to remind you, was consecrated Bishop of Tarsus at the tender age of 23. The young prodigy's astounding intellectual gifts, lofty theological vision, and youthful zeal are in full display in the letter, which serves as a rebuttal to specific accusations that had been lodged against the young archbishop by a coterie of monks from northern Armenia, led by Grigor Tuteorti, the primate of the monastery of Sanahin, and Tabit Kobayretsi, primate of the monastery of Hakhpat. Often referred to by their contemporaries as the Armenian Vartabeds of the northern regions, or by Nersess himself as the natives of Zoraget, the valley above which rise the Hakhpat and Sanahin monasteries, these resolutely traditionalist monks were staunch critics of the efforts of Catholicos Grigor Dara, the youth, to establish a union with the Byzantine Church. Ormanyan writes the following: "Holed up on the eastern frontier, detached from Western relations, the faithful guardians of primitive traditions, every notion of unity was suspect to the eyes of the natives of Zoraget. Wary of outsiders' proposals, they preferred to avoid all interaction with them in order to remain free of deception or of succumbing to danger." With his superlative intellectual sweep and visceral yearning for genuine Christian love and unity among the churches, Nersess became the Catholicos' ardent and outspoken advocate. He was also his second cousin, In so doing, he opened himself up to the vitriol of the northern monks. Some years later, allied with certain bishops, such as the charismatic Barser II of Ani, the northern Vartabeds wrote a letter, now lost, to King Levon I, demanding that the recent election of Catholicos Grigor Abirat be nullified in favor of their ideological champion, Barser, Basil. In the same context, they denounced the young Archbishop of Tarsus, demanding that he be dismissed from the royal palace and from the Catholicate on account of his dubious attraction to Western Christians, Byzantine and Roman, same word, and his penchant for unilaterally introducing new and foreign practices into the Armenian Church's liturgical life. If the king held firm in his support of Catholicos Grigor, he capitulated to the northern Vartabeds' outcry against Nersēs, whom he dismissed from the palace and ostensibly from his inner circle, though it is hard to believe that Levon would so easily have cut off all contact with his longtime and trusted confidants. At the same time, the king instructed Nersēs to retract his controversial liturgical reforms. In Nersēs's strident letter to the king, he writes the following: "Our Prince Hetum came and brought me a decree and order from you as if to an immature child, declaring that I am of no use to you, and that my conduct is out of order and useless, being out of line with our blessed Holy Fathers, and that I am going astray from their path." Nersēs's response to the inquiry of brother presbyters must be considered a counterpart to his letter to the king, a two-pronged effort to justify his actions and to clear his name. Nersēs feels obliged not only to respond to the northern Vartabeds, who have condemned him, but to respond as well to the king, who, by sustaining their objections, has lent them credence. In both letters, moreover, Nersēs's tactic is not only to refute the accusations of his antagonists point by point, but also to go on the offensive, identifying new and alien customs that the northern monks themselves had adopted. In this way, Nersēs lays bare their hypocrisy. Nersēs was well aware of liturgical improprieties at the monasteries of Harbat and Sanahin because, as he states in his letter to Levon, he had received quote, two or three insulting letters from them. And though in several places in the same letter, he states that he has not yet dignified these letters with a response, he notes, quote, "I have written a whole book outlining the abuses of our Armenian nation, which have crept into our usage." End of the quote. This, it seems, would be the book that becomes his response to the inquiry of brother presbyters, which is almost entirely devoted to refuting the northern Vartabeds' practice of dismissing the faithful from the church, an aberration he only mentions in passing in his letter to the king. Nersēs habitually quotes and then refutes apologetic statements by the Vartabeds that must have been made in that earlier correspondence. Furthermore, early in his letter, Nersēs refers to questions, khantir, they had posed, and he speaks of his readiness to provide a written account concerning the desirable rectitude in religion and rites as you request. Papakedi gronitz yev garkats ugutyun, azlur bani vorvasan aisorig, Artsanakutyamp Machtek. Nersēs's response opens with an extended introduction, seemingly seeking to elevate his dispute with the, quote, brother presbyters in the title of his treatise, above the letter of level of senseless bickering and blind self-justification. The Archbishop gives thanks to God for giving them all the opportunity to clarify the matters at hand, and in so doing, to be healed by God. Nersēs continues by laying out an apology for his youth, unworthiness, and presumptuousness in admonishing those whom he refers to as elders and graduates. For 4 pages in the printed edition, Nersēs begs his addressees not to accuse him of judging his brothers, lest he too be judged, as the Lord cautions. He forewarns his addressees that his words will be direct and bitter, and he portrays himself as a physician performing painful surgery in order to bring about healing. And I'll just read a couple of those, one passage. Now, when you hear these disputations and you are criticized according to conscience because you possess one of those things that are here rebuked, accept these words as sharing your grief and reproaching the infirmity from which you are suffering. For if physicians of the body often cauterize and amputate these very limbs of ours, and yet are not counted as enemies, how much more esteemed by all who desire salvation should I myself be, who yearn with bitter words to polish the soul's nobility and exterminate ghastly, disfiguring vermin by the anointing of the spirits? ? The young bishop's initial Christian modesty is offset, however, by the imperious tone that dominates the rest of the letter. And this came through my mind as Abraham was asking about, right, when a panegyric becomes more a reflection of the spirit, the character of the author. The introduction already employs dense and pompous language that is occasionally all but impenetrable to the modern reader. Nersēs clearly seeks at the outset to establish his scholarly and theological bona fides, as well as his authority to censure his brothers for maintaining what he argues to be an unorthodox, deplorable aberration. In so doing, he does not hesitate to characterize them as juvenile, darayagan or darayamin, for which reason he is compelled to yield to their feebleness, the godless truth. At the end of this extended prologue, Nersēs turns to the matter at hand at last, suddenly changing his language and tone to a more straightforward discursive style. Henceforth, until the end of the letter, his procedure will be quite the same. He quotes or alludes to a specific assertion from the brother's letter and then methodically refutes it. The brothers' first contention is that their practice is based on the tradition of the fathers. As Nersēs quotes them, they claim, quote, "We do not enter the church to pray, following the examples of the first ones," end of the quote. To this, Nersēs responds, and now I'm quoting Nersēs, "Which first ones, brother? Answer me. St. Gregory or Nersēs or Sahag or any of his sons whom we have as vicars of God and upon whom we are grounded? If they did not enter the church, then I accept and sustain your objection and I praise your support of the truth. But if much later some others, foreign to our saints, of whom we have neither word nor memory, showed us a way, I will consider it right to honor the regulation of their blessed memory. But on what basis does that other authority commend you to approve this practice if the Armenian forebears were praying in the church night and day in the monumental tabernacles that stand strong until today and which do not possess a narthex, jamadun, beside them? Indeed, Sahag, the Holy Father, seated near the Lord's altar, saw a marvelous vision, as the history tells. He and the Bakraduni kings and the patriarchs who were around them followed the same path. They built only churches as houses of prayer." Nersēs's first volley, therefore, consists in questioning the identity and authority of the unnamed fathers held up by the northern Vartabeds in support of their unusual practice. He observes that none of the Armenian church's rightful fathers could have possibly known of the custom of dismissing the faithful into the narthex, or jamadun, as he calls it, because no early church in Armenia possessed such an antechamber. The word jamadun literally means building for the hours, that is, the liturgy of the hours, or more generally, simply church chamber. Nersēs's use of the term makes clear that he is speaking of the kavit, the atrium that began to be added onto the western facade of monastic churches in Greater Armenia precisely during the period of concern to us, the first few centuries of the second millennium. So, if the anonymous fathers were not Armenian, Nersēs reasons, then they must have belonged to some other Christian nation. Yet, he argues, no other church any longer closes off the church sanctuary from the people. What the northern monasteries are doing is unknown anywhere else. Therefore, to support their controversial practice, the Armenian monks can only be leaning on the testimony of an unnamed, non-native tradition, which, in any case, has in the meantime discarded the practice. One may not, Nersēs insists, defend the legitimacy of a liturgical custom simply because it has been handed down from the past. This is what he writes. Tell me, whom do you confess to be your fathers? If you confess the apostles and the patriarchs who are still alive among us through the God-inspired words of the scriptures and who lead us to the truth, then I too am their advocate, and I have learned from them and followed them. However, if you confess allegiance to some others whose name does not appear among us, and from whom there is no written testimony as evidence of their orthodoxy, then we are obliged to study the issue critically and to evaluate whether they are not perhaps leading us astray from the track of the saints, as the elders of Israel led the people away from Moses. Now then, having put on a spirit of meekness and humility, come, let us examine together and compare the laws of these latter people, which are not set in writing, and those of their forerunners, who shine among us in writing and by their virtues. But since we have imparted in another place a word on the faith and on love toward Christian nations, now it remains for us to find the truth of the rites of the church, which is according to our holy fathers and the ways of the blessed ones. Not all tradition, the Archbishop declares, is sacred tradition. Not everything we do in church is a, quote, statute that your fathers established, end of quote. Some liturgical usages are simply customs or habits that have somehow persisted to our times, but which should not, in fact, be considered exemplary or normative. In questioning the authority of the fathers invoked by the monks, Nersēs reminds us that the legitimacy and value of, again, quote, the rites of the church are to be determined by each generation through a careful process of historical study of their transmission and their interpretation by known and authoritative church fathers. In the same context, the Vartabeds cited the so-called dismissal of the catechumens from the Armenian Badabak, the Divine Liturgy, the Holy Sacrifice, alleging that this ancient dismissal is the foundation for their current practice of sending the faithful out of the church. The Armenian version of the ancient dismissal reads, "Let none of the catechumens, none of deficient faith, and none of the penitents or impure come near this divine sacrament." I was going to ask Deacon Jesse to chant that for us in Armenian, but given the time limitations, I'll free him of that. Right? We know this from our Bata, so this is every Sunday. Nersēs maintains that the ancient dismissal was not intended to exile people from the church building, but only to restrict certain categories of the faithful from receiving Holy Communion. Otherwise, if the penitents were never allowed in the church, why should there have been a need to dismiss them? And this is what he writes. I accept such a divine and good regulation that has been transmitted from the fathers to us. However, according to the true power of the sacrament, or the mystery, it's the same word, I want to persuade you of it as well. Because, let us understand, the deacon discharges the people from the sacrament, not from the church. At the same time, the deacon gives the command to go out only when the Eucharist is conducted, not all the time, as it seems to you. The deacon's command itself demonstrates this. You were inside the church until that time, and from that place inside, he sends you out. For if it were their custom always to remain outside, as it is now for us, it would have been redundant to institute this command. Those of you who are outside, go outside and do not come near. On the contrary, they were in the churches, and at that time they retired. So the dismissal of the catechumens became a universal custom in all rites in the 4th century, with the rise of public penitential discipline. Yet it died out everywhere by the 7th century, even if the actual dismissal formula was preserved in the Armenian, Byzantine, and other rites. Today, in these rites, no one is really expected to depart from the church when they hear the deacon's command, let none of the catechumens, and so forth. Now, in the Armenian church, we have yet another seemingly indigenous dismissal that is even more explicitly imperative and which precedes the kiss of peace. Deacon Jesse. Right? Those of you who are not able to share in the divine mystery, go to the doors and pray. Already in the mid-10th century, Bishop Khosrov Ansevatsi, in his commentary on the Holy Sacrifice, had a variation of this dismissal. In his commentary, he says, "You who are unable to share communion, learn from one another and pray at the doors." There can be no doubt that for Khosrov, this was a real dismissal. Those who are impure or defiled in spirit should leave. Again, I'm quoting him. "With mournful heart and fervent tears, let them lament their exclusion," he comments. Today, this dismissal no longer functions as such, although it remains as sort of a verbal formula in the liturgy. As for the 12th century monks of Hachbat and Sanahin, we do not know if they knew of this dismissal, since Nersēs, although he was writing from Cilicia, mentions it neither in his letter to them nor in his own commentary on the Badarak, which has its own set of requirements for properly being understood. There's a great deal of Byzantine influence in that commentary, and he's not necessarily reading the Armenian Badarak word for word and commenting on it. He is commenting on a sort of ideal Armenian Byzantine fusion, which he was promoting. So the fact that he doesn't mention this particular dismissal doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't there. Yet even if he does not allude to this particular formula, Nersēs, in his explanation on the deacon's command, Esteruns, the doors, within his commentary on the Holy Badarak, the Archbishop does indeed suggest that the unworthies have been escorted to the doors of the church. I'm not going to read that quotation, trust me. In any case, Nersēs's counter-argument remains cogent. There would be no need for any dismissal formula at all if the people were already standing outside the church. More important, Nersēs's testimony confirms irrefutably that the practice of the northern Vartabeds, which attracted his ire, is not simply the rehabilitation of the old dismissal of the catechumens, nor even its extension to include all of the faithful, not just the penitents and catechumens. Nersēs confirms this in his commentary on the Holy Badarak, where in his nuanced explanation of the dismissal formula, none of the catechumens, he supports the principle of dismissing the unworthies from the church into the kavit, the narthex, at the end of the liturgy of the word, while acknowledging that already in his time, no one any longer actually departed when the deacons chanted the dismissal. In that passage, the Archbishop of Lambron, first of all, acknowledges that contrary to the wording in the ancient dismissal formula, in his time, there were no longer any catechumens, making that aspect of the dismissal obsolete. This is why that dismissal disappeared in every rite already very early, at least by the 7th century. Right. As for the penitents and the impure, he writes, we do not dismiss them. By this, he means that they are no longer dismissed entirely from the church to go back home. By his understanding, in ancient times, the penitents went home when they were sent out of the church. But sending the penitents away from the rest of the faithful, he argues, is no longer an effective penitential therapy. As Christian piety has declined, people no longer understand their excommunication to be a shameful sanction. One thinks of a delinquent teenager who welcomes his suspension from school as vacation. Instead, Nersēs advocates a dismissal that separates the unworthies from the faithful and from Holy Communion. Advocates a dismissal that separates the unworthies from the faithful and from Holy Communion, but stops short of leaving them to their leisure. They are to gather in the kabit, where they remain in the embrace of the church, and whence they can at least follow the Eucharist, even if they may not share in it. It follows, therefore, that what Nersēs is denouncing in the monasteries of Hachbat and Sanahin is indeed something much more radical than the mere revival of the age-old pre-anaphoral dismissal. It must be a complete prohibition of anyone from even entering the church, not just during the Eucharistic prayer and Holy Communion, but for all liturgical activities. Another argument adduced by the monks in support of their practice is that when churches are dedicated and consecrated, they are anointed with holy chrism. It would thus follow, they seem to claim, that sinners should not be worthy to enter the sacred precincts of the church. Nersēs responds that it is not only churches that are anointed with chrism. At their baptism, all the faithful are consecrated with one and the same holy chrism and the same Holy Spirit. Feeling compelled to provide a refresher on the Armenian Church's theology of baptism, he writes this: "We men were dead in our sins, being alive to the world, but dead to God. Then, when we came to have faith in him, we died in the waters of the font of the world, and we became alive to God. And after rising from the water, we received the seal of the Holy Chrism, the grace of the Holy Spirit descending upon us, which was given to mankind by Christ, and we became thenceforth a temple of God. In like manner, this church was an element without breath and without strength. We pray in it, and we imprint the grace of the Holy Spirit upon it with the chrism, and we strengthen that which has no strength. And through the Spirit, we give life to that which has no life. And it is the same Spirit who dwelled in us and in it, the same Spirit that made it, through us, a temple of God and the mother of us all. Therefore, strengthened by one Spirit, why do we loathe one another?" Very powerful. So it is not only the church building that is consecrated a temple of God, but each baptized member of the church too is not only consecrated and anointed, but thereby made into a temple of the Holy Spirit, as St. Paul the Apostle asserts, and as the Armenian rite of baptism confirms. In this way, Nersēs demonstrates the fundamental error in the monks' reasoning, which he effectively turns against them. The church is the native and inalienable home of all who have been baptized in Christ and anointed with the Holy Spirit. But what harm can there possibly be in praying outside if, as the monks further contend, quoting 1 Timothy, in every place they should lift up their holy hands without anger or doubt? Nersēs replies that the church is consecrated. It is set apart as the privileged place for prayer. In support of this, he cites 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 22 to 23, where St. Paul writes, "Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God?" The Archbishop then goes on to give 5 arguments that substantiate this claim. First, he gives an extended analogy of a king in his palace. The king's power and sovereignty extend invisibly throughout his dominion, far and wide. Yet those who wish to speak with the king must come into his personal presence, because his inknutun, his essence or identity or selfhood, are to be found uniquely in his palace. Likewise, Nersēs submits, although God's power and sovereignty cannot be circumscribed, his inknutun is to be found in the church. I quote him, "If we become negligent and do not enter his house, how can we see his face?" he asks. Second, praying outside the church impedes comprehension. Very interesting. The Archbishop states that when standing outside the confines of the sanctity of the church, the prayers are reduced to vague sounds. The sense of meaning of our worship is lost. Sense of meaning, ush imastits, and with it, our attention. When the Divine Liturgy was celebrated in Hachbat and Sanahin, only the celibate priest was permitted to enter the church. And those that have seen the monastic churches in what is now the Republic of Armenia, you know that the doorway between the narthex and the church itself is tiny. And it's often, a meter or more higher than the level, lower than the level of the sanctuary. So I was just at Hachbat a few weeks ago, and I carefully looked at this again. There's no way that you can follow and hear what's being chanted in the church and at the eastern end of the church. There's no way. So there's no way that one can argue that the kavit was intended as somehow kind of an extension of the worship space in any way. Third, and even more egregious, quote, when standing outside, we despise the great and most supreme redemption, the mystery of the Badarak, Nersēs objects. Continuing, we are starved of communion with the one who offers and of the sweetness of the sacrament. Evidently, the people outside the church were indeed excommunicated. Furthermore, Nersēs points out a fourth and even more fundamental contradiction in the Eastern monks' practice. Far from safeguarding the sacredness of the sacrament and motivating the faithful to live out their Christian vocation more responsibly, the general dismissal of all the people actually nullifies the essential distinction between the worthy and the unworthy. Since all the people, without distinction, are gathered together outside the church, those who are truly in need of penance lose any sense of remorse and shame that might have resulted from their being set apart from those who are worthy. Not entering the church becomes normative, and the whole enterprise becomes futile. Indeed, even priests and monks in the communities of Nersēs's detractors were exiled from the church. And I'll quote Nersēs again. And as for you, O priest, who yesterday presided over the Badarak, why does the deacon today have the authority to give you the same command to go outside with the catechumens, or to repudiate you, a Christian and a monk, along with those who have no faith? And I ask you, by what scruple do you pray outside the church today, but enter it tomorrow? To sanction the clergy and monks in this way subverts their divinely ordained ministry, sinful though they may be. And what is far worse, the monks defending this practice do so out of a perverted sense of piety. They readily retreat to the narthex with the sinners out of a misplaced and exaggerated sense of disrepute. Those who have set out most diligently on the path of Christian discipleship, who claim to be crucified with Christ and dead to the world, role models for the people, they renounce their vocation, their ministry, and Christ himself by abandoning themselves to the narthex. Nersēs harshly admonishes the monks for this reasoning, which he unmasks as little more than a pretense for what is actually simple laziness. The closed doors of the church become a convenient excuse for the people not to go to church at all. It's also a cause for scandal. Nersēs alleges, fifth and finally, that when the usual hierarchical distinctions are erased in this way, the people become negligent in their own commitment to Christian liturgy. He writes, now whether you are a priest, deacon, or novice, you are the masters of this house. Why do you wish to be outside the place of your dominion and to be relegated among the unbelievers? And behold, the unbelievers were set apart not from this church, but from the sacrament. By always standing outside the church, you are personally condemning yourself. The church is the priest's throne, the novice's dominion, the monk's place of prayer, mother of the lay people, and the sinner's place of expiation. Further down he writes, now, brother, if you are not worthy to enter this house of God, who do you dare to accomplish your mediation with the people and with God? Who, when speaking with the king, does not consider himself worthy to enter the king's mansion? And that is how you speak, O priest, face to face, lovingly, when you conduct the priestly ministry. But separated, you do not enter this place for that task. You are charged as a messenger from your people to God. If you do not enter his temple, how can you speak? With this final strike, Nersēs draws his letter to a close. Nersēs's response to the northern monks is a pivotal document that allows us to make sense of the many fleeting and tantalizing references in Armenian literary sources from the 12th through the early 15th centuries to dismissing the people from the church. Even if we allow for a degree of hyperbole in Nersēs's polemical and emotional letter, there can be no doubt that the archbishop is railing against an extraordinary abuse attending in the northern monasteries. This is not simply the rehabilitation or the broadening application of the old dismissal of the catechumens, but a general, all-inclusive expulsion of all the people and non-presiding clergy from the church at all times, bizarre as that may seem to our modern liturgical sensibilities. In his response, Nersēs cites the northern Vartabeds frequently, evidently from some previous correspondence between the protagonists. From these citations and Nersēs's systematic refutations, it is evident that the Vartabeds were motivated by a severe, if misplaced, penitential piety. Their zeal is not to be explained by simple clericalism, since even the priests and monks were barred from the church. Instead, the Vartabeds of Hachbad and Sanahin have come to hold the church and the church's liturgy in such high regard that in their estimation, no mortal is any longer worthy of it. The monks saw themselves and their people in an ever-darkening light. For some reason, during these centuries, the monks of Greater Armenia could not face the merciful Lord or accept his redemption. Alas, the current state of our knowledge does not permit us to explain this extremist view, except to suggest that it cannot be unrelated to the unrelenting waves of violence that brought death and destruction to Armenia in this era, beginning with the Byzantines in the 11th century, followed by the Seljuk and other Turkic tribes, Mongols, Mamluks. The sources of this period are filled with accounts of Armenian bishops, monks, and theologians confessing that their violent fate was a consequence of their own national and personal sinfulness. A similar attitude of self-loathing has also been observed among some other Christian groups in their reactions to the Islamic conquests of the 7th century. The Armenian monks internalized their sense of desperation, and it took root in their liturgical life with reverberations that can still be felt today. Yet between the lines of Nersess's impassioned and erudite argumentation, we discover an elegant case study and guide to proper liturgical reform. The Archbishop effectively distinguishes between a tradition and a sacred tradition. The sacred tradition is not simply the sum total of every ritual, prayer, or other liturgical or para-liturgical usage that has a precedent in history. Components of the sacred tradition must fit seamlessly together with every other component of the sacred tradition by means of theological vision that the church must recapture in every new generation. One thinks of a jigsaw puzzle. Every piece must slip into its place securely and effortlessly, every notch clicking into the correct adjoining groove, such that the colorful pattern on its face completes the full picture. One may neither force the piece into position nor overlook the distorted picture that results from doing so, nor simply discard the pieces that do not conveniently find a suitable home. Using theological, historical, and common sense logical arguments, Nersēs exposes the error in the Vartabeds' actions and reasoning. The universal prohibition of the clergy and faithful from entering the church is at odds with the larger sacred tradition of the church. Like the puzzle piece that is wedged into the wrong slot, the arguments advanced by the Vartabeds in favor of their practice, noble and sincere as their intent may be, conflict with the theology and history of the church. Consequently, the picture that emerges, that is, the larger function of the liturgy, the nature of the church, and the gospel itself become distorted, causing fatal and systemic problems and repercussions, which Nersēs is at pains to single out. Nersēs Shnorhali thus provides a model for us today as we evaluate liturgical usages and traditions that have been passed down to us. Everything we do in church, every prayer we utter, every chant we intone, every gesture we make, and every sacred object we ply has a history, more or less venerable and old. Everything has been handed down to us and has a precedent of some sort. Thus, everything is, in a sense, traditional. But, as St. Paul himself proclaimed to the Corinthians regarding another liturgical abuse, not everything is edifying. All things are lawful, he writes, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. The great challenge of the Armenian church and of all ancient churches today is much more than merely to safeguard its ancient liturgical and theological patronage. The role of the bishops, that's me, and of all the clergy is not simply, in other words, to serve as the church's custodians. The true task is the much more formidable endeavor exemplified in Lampronați's response to Northern Vartags, to engage themselves in an ongoing, critical, yet prayerful re-evaluation and re-proclamation of the entire sacred tradition, an enterprise that is grounded in theological and historical study, and whose sights must always extend beyond the individual ingredients of the tradition, the individual puzzle pieces, to the larger picture, which is nothing less than the love of God in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yet in spite of Nersess's erudite and impassioned efforts, the brother monks seem not to have been swayed. The exaggerated penitential piety of the northern monasteries appears to have continued unabated. In fact, in subsequent centuries, monasteries in northern and eastern Armenia would build ever more imposing and more elaborate narthexes, which in some cases were many times larger than the actual church sanctuary. The monumental narthexes built onto the sanctuaries of Hakhbat and especially Sanahin and many others are perhaps the best examples. In Sanahin, the narthex is fully 5 times larger in area than the sanctuary itself. Is there a genetic link between the tenacious, if troublesome, practices of the northern monasteries and the equally tenacious and troublesome custom throughout the Armenian church today of closing the sanctuary curtain and withholding Holy Communion from the faithful at Eucharistic liturgies during Great Lent, a practice that is unattested in any liturgical book or canon to my knowledge? I think so. Anton Baumstark, the great Orientalist, his law of the preservation of ancient liturgical usages in more solemn seasons of the church year would seem to make such a prospect conceivable. In a just published study, I have argued that the construction of the kavits is best explained as accommodating the large numbers of people who were excluded from those churches during the period under investigation, in the region under investigation, roughly a 100-mile perimeter around Lake Sevan. How did the northern monks' penitential heterodoxy continue to fuel the perpetuation of certain liturgical and theological aberrations that affect the Armenian church to this day? I hope to be able to answer that in a more compelling way as my work continues. Thank you for your undue patience.
Well, thank you, everyone. This very interesting and I would say a thorough discussion on some of the topics presented by Bishop Daniel. Thank you so much, Bishop Daniel, for being here in person with us. Thank you for the presentation, but also engaging with the discussion. That's been very, very nice. I want to thank our audience online. Thank you for staying with us during the duration of this today's conference. This concludes day 2 of our St. Nersēs Shnorhali conference at the seminary. Tomorrow we resume 10 a.m. sharp to stay on to stay on track. We will have a panel Nersess before and after. Dr. Irvin and I would present on the panel our papers with Sergio Laporta joining us from Fresno, California. And then with a short break after, we will hear from our very own Professor Peter Cowie joining us from UCLA here in person. And thank you very much for being here, Professor Cowie. It's really a privilege and an honor to have you here. So thank you. So please enjoy your evening, rest well. I hope that you are all able to join us tomorrow and looking forward to seeing you. Thank you again, once again for a very vibrant and exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for staying with us, everyone. Great night. Have a good night. What's left of your night?